Chapter 51. The Escalator Launch. The escalator was moving, and he was not. That was the first thing the cameras registered. The studied stillness of a man descending through a building that bore his name, his right hand resting on the moving rail with the proprietary ease of someone touching something that belongs to him, his face set in the expression he had perfected across 14 seasons of television. Not quite a smile, not quite a scowl, but something composed and deliberate that existed in the precise register between confidence and contempt. Melania was beside him, in a white dress that the fashion press would spend the afternoon identifying and contextualizing. And behind them, the atrium of Trump Tower opened upward in its familiar cascade of pink marble and brass, and the ambient sound of a building that had been built to announce in every material particular that its owner had won something. The crowd below, a mixture of invited supporters, curious onlookers, reporters, and it would later emerge, a number of people who had been paid $40 each by a casting agency to hold signs and provide the visual grammar of a rally, made the noise that crowds make when a figure they have been waiting for arrives. He stepped off the escalator and walked to the podium and looked out at the cameras with the recognition of a man who had spent decades understanding that the camera was the true constituency, that the room was always secondary to the lens, and he began to speak. What he said in the next 45 minutes would be parsed and analyzed and condemned and celebrated and replayed more times than almost any political speech in the preceding decade. But its immediate reception in the room where it happened had a quality that none of the subsequent analysis fully captured. It was surprising. Not surprising in its content. Trump had been saying versions of these things for years, in interviews and books, and the Reform Party flirtation of 1999, and 1,000 moments of television candor that the political press had always treated as entertainment rather than policy, but surprising in its register, in the rawness and specificity and duration of the performance, in the way it violated every convention of the announcement speech as a political form. Presidential announcements, in the established grammar of American politics, were carefully choreographed exercises in aspiration and unity, speeches written by teams of consultants who had focus-grouped every phrase, and whose overriding purpose was to introduce the candidate to a national audience in the most broadly appealing terms possible. What Trump delivered instead was something closer to a sustained grievance, a catalog of American decline, delivered with the specificity of a man who had been composing it privately for years and had decided on this particular Tuesday in June 2015 that the time for private composition was finished. The world that June 16, 2015 inhabited was one of strange and particular anxiety, a country that had emerged from the financial crisis of 2008 with its economic statistics largely restored, but its social fabric frayed in ways that the statistics were not designed to measure. Unemployment was below 6%. The stock market had more than doubled from its crisis lows. The Obama administration was pointing to these numbers as evidence of successful stewardship. But the recovery had been distributed with a geographic and demographic precision that made it feel, to a significant portion of the country, like someone else's recovery. The communities that had organized themselves around manufacturing, around steel and coal and automotive assembly, around the kind of work that a man without a college degree could use to build a life of recognizable dignity, had not recovered in any meaningful sense, and their non-recovery was invisible in the aggregate figures that Washington discussed and the financial press reported. The opioid epidemic was advancing through these communities with a thoroughness that suicide statistics and overdose mortality rates were only beginning to make visible to policymakers who lived in zip codes where the epidemic had not yet arrived. The political establishment of both parties had arrived at a consensus about trade and immigration and the management of American decline that this population had not been consulted about and did not share, and the establishment's confidence in its own consensus had made it incapable of hearing the signals that were arriving, loud and consistent, from the people who lived inside its consequences. Trump had been listening to those signals, or something like them, for longer than the political professionals who dismissed his candidacy that afternoon understood. His instinct for audience, sharpened across decades of real estate marketing and television production and seminar promotion, had been telling him for years that there was a constituency in the American electorate that was waiting for a specific kind of messenger, one who would say the things that the messenger's own comfort and security made it unnecessary to say, one who would give voice to a rage that the political class had diagnosed as illegitimate and therefore felt justified in ignoring. The 2011 experience of the birther controversy, his sustained and nationally televised challenge to Barack Obama's citizenship, which the political press had treated as a disqualifying eccentricity, and which had instead demonstrated in the polling that followed it, that a substantial portion of the Republican electorate was prepared to follow someone willing to say it, had been a data point. The rallies he had attended in the years since, the crowds that formed around him when he appeared in political contexts, the mail and the calls, and the particular quality of public recognition he received in airports and restaurants outside of New York, had been data points. The accumulated data had produced a conclusion that he had been testing privately for years and was now on this escalator testing publicly, that the political marketplace contained a demand that no existing supplier was meeting, and that he was the supplier. The core conflict of the announcement and the days that immediately followed it was not, as the political press framed it, between Trump and the other candidates in the Republican field, 16 of whom were either already declared or preparing to declare, most of them presenting better credentials by conventional measures, and none of them generating a fraction of the media coverage that Trump's announcement produced before the afternoon was out. The conflict was more fundamental. It was between Trump's understanding of what the campaign was and the political establishment's understanding of what a campaign was required to be. The establishment, the donors, the consultants, the party infrastructure, the editorial boards, the television analysts, who spent that afternoon explaining why the announcement was a publicity stunt that would dissolve within weeks, operated according to a theory of electoral politics in which organization and money and policy sophistication and the endorsements of respected figures were the primary inputs. Trump was operating according to a different theory, one in which attention was the primary input and everything else was downstream of it, and in which the media environment of 2015, fragmented, accelerating, organized around engagement metrics that rewarded conflict and novelty and outrage above all other content, was structurally incapable of ignoring him regardless of what its practitioners thought of him. He understood, in other words, that the press's contempt was not a cost. It was a subsidy. The speech contained the sentence about Mexican immigrants, the characterization of people crossing the border illegally as including rapists and criminals, qualified by the acknowledgement that some, I assume, are good people, a qualification whose structural placement ensured that it functioned as an intensifier rather than a softener. And the sentence was the pivot point around which the announcement's reception organized itself. The political press treated it as a gaffe of disqualifying magnitude, as the kind of statement that ended campaigns in the conventional political grammar. Within the Republican establishment, calls were made and assessments rendered, and the consensus was quick and confident. This was the moment that would end the Trump candidacy before it fully began. What happened instead, in the polling that followed the speech by several days, was the opposite of what the consensus had predicted. His numbers moved upward. The statement had not cost him support among the people he was speaking to. It had confirmed something they felt he understood about them, something about whose concerns he took seriously and whose concerns he did not, something about the distance between the political class's sense of what was appropriate to say and the electorate's sense of what was true to say, and Trump had landed with his characteristic accuracy in reading a room on exactly the right side of that distance for the audience he was assembling. The specific anecdote that most completely illuminates his posture on the day of the announcement, the keyhole into his character in this defining moment, involves the preparation, or more precisely, the deliberate absence of it. His political advisors, in the days before June 16th, had prepared briefing materials, talking points, policy summaries, the conventional architecture of a prepared announcement speech, and Trump had reviewed them with the attention he characteristically devoted to documents that other people believed were important, partial, distracted, and ultimately superseded by his own sense of what the moment required. He did not use the talking points. The speech he delivered was, by the account of people who were backstage and who had seen the prepared materials, substantially improvised, or at least substantially departed from any prepared text, shaped in the delivery by his reading of the room and the cameras and the particular energy of the moment. He had decided, consciously or by the instinct that in a man of his experience was indistinguishable from conscious decision, that a prepared speech was a politician's speech, and that the entire argument he was making rested on the proposition that he was not a politician. To read from a teleprompter on the day he announced his candidacy was to concede, at the moment of maximum visibility, the thing he most needed to deny. The improvisation was the message. Corey Lewandowski, who had been brought on as campaign manager in the months before the announcement, was the figure whose relationship with Trump in this period illuminates most clearly the organizational culture of the campaign that was being assembled. Lewandowski was not a figure of the Republican establishment. He was a New Hampshire political operative of aggressive temperament and limited national experience, and his selection as the campaign's senior operational figure was itself a signal about the kind of campaign Trump intended to run. The establishment candidates had campaign managers with Rolodexes full of major donors and relationships with the consultants who managed the infrastructure of national campaigns. Lewandowski had Trump's phone number and Trump's confidence and a willingness to operate in the manner Trump required, which was fast and instinctive, and without the institutional deference that experienced campaign professionals brought to their work as a matter of professional self-preservation. The relationship between them was, in its early months, straightforwardly functional. Lewandowski executing Trump's instincts, Trump providing the direction and the media oxygen that made execution possible. But it was also a relationship that was already, by the summer of 2015, generating friction with the other figures in Trump's orbit who felt that their own access and influence was being managed by a man who had been in the organization for months rather than decades. The friction was quiet in June. It would not remain quiet. Melania stood beside him on the escalator and at the podium and in the photographs that the wire services transmitted that afternoon to every news organization in the world. And her presence in those images was precise and composed in the way that her presence always was. A woman who had learned, across years of public life, beside a man whose public life consumed everything around it, to occupy her position without competing for the frame. She had been consulted about the decision to run, or at least she had been present for the conversations in which the decision was made. And the accounts of people close to her during this period suggest a woman who understood the magnitude of what was beginning, without being entirely certain she welcomed it. She was not a political spouse in any traditional sense. She had no particular appetite for the machinery of campaigns, for the retail glad-handing, and the rope lines and the organizational dinners that constituted the social infrastructure of electoral politics. She was a private person who had constructed a private life inside a very public marriage, and the campaign that her husband was launching on this escalator on this Tuesday afternoon was going to make the privacy she had maintained through considerable effort and discipline functionally impossible to sustain. She stood beside him and smiled at the cameras and gave the images what they required, which was the picture of a united front. And what she thought about what was beginning was something she kept, with the characteristic discipline of a woman who had always understood that what you did not say was as important as what you did, entirely to herself. The afternoon ended with a press conference of controlled chaos, reporters shouting questions that Trump answered or deflected or reframed, with the fluid confidence of a man who had been doing press conferences for 40 years and found them, unlike most politicians, genuinely energizing rather than merely necessary. He left the building, through a side entrance with his security detail and his family and the small cluster of advisors who had attached themselves to the launch. And by the time his motorcade was moving south on Fifth Avenue, the cable networks had already been running coverage for 2 hours, and the Twitter conversation had generated more engagement than any political event in months. The political analysts were explaining why the campaign would fail. The Republican establishment was issuing carefully worded statements about civility and the party's commitment to inclusive language. The other candidates in the field were conferring with their advisors about how to respond, most of them arriving at the same conclusion, that engaging directly with Trump would elevate him, and that the correct strategy was to wait for him to self-destruct, which he would do, they were confident, within weeks. They were operating according to a theory of political gravity that held that what goes up in a blaze of controversy comes down in an equal blaze of consequence, and they were not wrong that this was how the physics of conventional campaigns operated. What they had not yet understood, what the summer and fall of 2015 would teach them, at escalating cost, was that the campaign descending the Trump Tower escalator was not a conventional campaign, and that the physics they were applying with such confidence and such precision belonged to a different world than the one that had just begun. Chapter 52. Make America Great Again. The escalator was moving at the speed escalators move, which is to say slowly, and Trump was moving at the speed Trump moved, which was also slowly when the occasion called for it, and the occasion called for it now. It was June 16, 2015, and the atrium of Trump Tower had been dressed for the announcement. The crowd assembled below, the cameras positioned at the angles that the building's architecture permitted, the Neil Young song playing from the speakers in a usage that Young would subsequently and strenuously object to, and Trump descended through all of it with the deliberateness of a man who had thought carefully about how a person looks when they are about to change the direction of their country. Melania was beside him, in white. The flags were behind him, American and Trump Organization, paired in an equivalence that was either accidental or was the morning's most precise communication, depending on how carefully you were paying attention. When he reached the bottom and approached the microphone and began to speak, the prepared remarks in front of him served primarily as a departure point, because Trump's most consequential public performances had always been the ones where the prepared text gave way to the associative, the immediate, the unfiltered version of whatever he was actually thinking. And what he was actually thinking on June 16, 2015, about Mexico and about trade and about the country's leadership and about winning, poured out of him in a torrent that the political press corps, which had covered announcement speeches for decades and had developed finely calibrated instruments for assessing their significance, was not equipped to correctly measure. The America that Trump was announcing his candidacy into was experiencing a specific variety of political and cultural stress that the institutions responsible for managing it had been slow to acknowledge and slower to address. The Obama years had produced, in the specific communities that Trump was targeting, a combination of economic grievance and cultural displacement that the Democratic Party's coalition politics had structurally deprioritized, and that the Republican establishment's donor class priorities had addressed only rhetorically. The manufacturing job losses that had been building since the 1990s, accelerated by NAFTA, deepened by China's entry into the WTO in 2001, sustained through the financial crisis and the recovery that followed it, had hollowed out the economic infrastructure of specific geographic communities in specific states whose electoral votes were the precise votes that a candidate running Trump's version of the economic nationalist argument needed to convert. The opioid crisis, which would not achieve its full media saturation until 2016 and 2017, was already devastating the same communities. Small and mid-sized cities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, where the departure of manufacturing had removed not merely the jobs, but the social architecture that the jobs had sustained. The union halls, the bowling leagues, the dense networks of neighborhood institution that Robert Putnam had spent a decade documenting in their decline. The people in those communities were not, in the main, following the political news with close attention. They were living the consequences of decisions that the political news had covered as abstractions: trade policy, immigration enforcement, financial regulation, and they were available in a way that the political class had not fully measured to a candidate who spoke about those consequences in the language of lived experience rather than policy analysis. Trump had spent the preceding 3 years assembling, through The Apprentice, and through his political commentary, and through the birther period, and through the CPAC speeches, and the Fox News appearances, an argument whose components were individually familiar but whose combination was new. The economic nationalism, the China trade argument, the OPEC argument, the Allies not paying their fair share argument, had a lineage that ran through Buchanan and Perot. The immigration argument was distinct from its predecessors in a specific register. It was not primarily a labor market argument about the wage depression effects of undocumented workers competing with native-born Americans for low-skill jobs, though Trump made that argument too. It was a safety argument, a sovereignty argument, a characterization of the southern border as a place where the Mexican government was deliberately directing its criminals and its problem populations into the United States, and where the American government's failure to prevent this represented a dereliction so fundamental that it called into question not merely the competence of the officials responsible, but their basic commitment to the people they were supposed to serve. This was not a mainstream Republican argument in June of 2015. It was an argument that the Republican establishment, still processing the 2013 autopsy and still committed to its conclusion that Hispanic outreach was the party's electoral imperative, would have characterized as politically suicidal. Trump made it anyway, in the second paragraph of his announcement speech, and the political class spent the following weeks waiting for the polls to confirm their assessment of its toxicity. The polls did not confirm it. They moved in the opposite direction. Trump's favorable ratings among Republican primary voters began rising within days of the announcement, driven by a response to the immigration remarks that the political class had predicted would be negative, and that was, within the specific electorate of a Republican primary, substantially positive, not because Republican primary voters were uniformly hostile to immigrants, which they were not, but because the argument that the border was unsecured and that the government had chosen not to secure it resonated with a conviction about governmental dysfunction and elite indifference that the immigration specifics were serving as a vehicle for expressing. The issue was immigration. The emotion was abandonment. Trump had found the vehicle for the emotion, and the emotion was more widely and deeply held than any poll measuring opinion on immigration policy had been calibrated to detect. The core conflict of the campaign's opening phase was not external, not the other 16 Republicans in the primary field, whose responses to his announcement ranged from dismissal to alarm, but internal to the political logic of the campaign itself. Trump had entered the race with an argument, and without an organization, which in the history of presidential campaigns was an arrangement that had never produced a nomination. The professional infrastructure of a major party presidential campaign, the pollsters, the field directors, the state-by-state delegate operation, the finance team, the communications apparatus, existed because presidential campaigns were, in their operational reality, large, complex organizations requiring management across 50 states and over the course of a year, and the absence of that infrastructure had historically been not merely a disadvantage but a disqualifying one. Trump had, as of June 2015, a skeletal staff, a campaign manager in Corey Lewandowski, whose previous experience was in field operations rather than presidential campaign management, and a theory, implicit rather than articulated, that the rules governing what a presidential campaign required were rules that applied to candidates who needed the professional infrastructure to substitute for the attention-generating capacity that they lacked. Trump did not lack that capacity. What his campaign was testing, without fully knowing it was testing this, was whether the attention generation function of a modern presidential campaign could be performed by a single individual with sufficient media mastery, at sufficient volume, to substitute for the organizational infrastructure that previous campaigns had built specifically to perform that function. The revealing action of the campaign's opening is a decision Trump made about debate preparation, or rather, a sustained refusal to engage with debate preparation in the form that his advisors proposed. The first Republican primary debate was scheduled for August 6, 2015, on Fox News, with 10 candidates on the stage and an audience of television viewers that would ultimately exceed 24 million people, the largest audience for a primary debate in American political history to that point. The standard practice for a presidential debate, as established by decades of campaign convention, involved extensive preparation, mock debates conducted against stand-ins for the opposing candidates, detailed briefings on policy specifics, coaching on the physical presentation of responses, the development of tested lines for anticipated attack vectors. Trump's team proposed versions of this preparation. Trump declined them, not in a single decisive refusal, but in a series of diversions, meetings that became conversations rather than preparation sessions, briefing materials that were glanced at rather than absorbed, mock debate setups that were abandoned before they could function as rehearsal. What he substituted for formal preparation was his own accumulated understanding of how television performance worked, how a camera captured a person's relationship to a room, how a live audience responded to specificity and contempt and humor, and the particular kind of directness that policy-trained candidates systematically avoided because their advisors had told them the avoidance was safety. He walked onto the debate stage, having prepared, essentially, by being himself for 69 years and the debate that resulted. His exchange with Megyn Kelly about his history of comments about women, his response to which was to suggest that Kelly's questioning was hormonally motivated, generating a controversy that consumed the following week's news cycle in ways that every communications professional in the field predicted would be fatal, and that were not, confirmed for Trump what he had long suspected, that the rules of political communication had been written by people who assumed that the penalty for transgression would be applied, and that the penalty's application was contingent on conditions that his specific situation did not meet. The relationship that most shaped the campaign's opening months was the one Trump was building through the rallies that began in the summer of 2015 and that became the campaign's operational center of gravity with the audience that came to see him. The rallies were different from the campaign events that the other candidates were staging. They were larger, in venues whose capacity exceeded what the other candidates could fill, and whose scale communicated, in the visual language of crowd photography, something about the nature of what was happening. They were louder, not merely in decibels, but in the quality of the emotional register they occupied, which was closer to the register of a revival meeting or a sporting event than to the register of a political rally in the conventional sense, where the enthusiasm was mobilization-directed and somewhat formal. And they were improvisational in a way that no other candidate's events were, because Trump spoke at them without a prepared text, in the free associative, anecdote and grievance, repetition and escalation mode that he had been refining through decades of press calls and television appearances and CPAC speeches. And the audiences received this mode not as a departure from political normalcy, but as evidence of authenticity, the mark of a man saying what he actually thought rather than what his consultants had determined was optimally positioned. The feedback loop between Trump and the rally crowds was immediate and physical in a way that a television appearance could not replicate. And Trump, who had always been acutely sensitive to the response of a room, calibrated his material against the crowd's response with the efficiency of a performer who has been reading audiences his entire professional life. Lines that landed were repeated and expanded. Lines that didn't were dropped without ceremony. The speeches across the summer of 2015 became, through this iterative process, increasingly precise instruments of emotional activation, less about the policy content of economic nationalism or immigration restriction, though both were present, than about the emotional state those issues represented access to, the conviction that something had been taken, that the taking had been deliberate, that the people responsible were knowable and known, and that the man at the microphone was not only willing to say so but was, uniquely among the people who had been offered to the country as its potential leaders, capable of doing something about it. By the fall of 2015, the polls had not corrected. The political class had been predicting, at each successive stage of the campaign, the announcement, the immigration remarks, the first debate, the McCain comment about not being a war hero because he was captured, that the correction was imminent, that the transgression du jour would be the one that finally activated the penalty mechanism that the norms of political communication existed to enforce. The corrections did not come, and the non-arrival of the corrections began to produce, in the more attentive observers of the Republican primary, a recalibration of their models, a reluctant acknowledgement that they were watching something that their existing frameworks for understanding presidential campaigns were not designed to explain, that the relationship between candidate behavior and voter response in this race was operating by a set of rules that the professional political class had not encountered before and was not equipped in real time to navigate. What those observers could not yet see, and what would not become fully visible until the delicate mathematics of the following spring made it undeniable, was that the recalibration they were performing was not merely about Trump, not merely about this race, but about the electorate itself, about what a significant portion of the American public had been waiting for, and was now for the first time being offered in a form that felt sufficient to the waiting, and that once offered in that form would prove extraordinarily difficult to refuse. Chapter 53. Primary Warfare. The debate stage in Cleveland was enormous and deliberately lit. 10 podiums arranged in a configuration that the Fox News producers had designed to communicate consequence, the visual grammar of something historic, or at least historically watched. And Trump stood at the center podium because the polls said he belonged there, and the polls were the only criterion Fox had announced it would use for placement, and so the math had put him where he had always believed he belonged, at the center of any room he entered. He had arrived at the Quicken Loans Arena with the particular economy of motion of a man conserving something, moving through the pre-debate logistics, the green room, the makeup chair, the brief consultation with advisors whose advice he would absorb selectively, with none of the visible anxiety that most of the other 9 candidates on the stage were generating in their own preparations. Jeb Bush was reviewing note cards. Marco Rubio was working a rosary. Chris Christie was doing what Christie always did in high-pressure social situations, which was perform gregariousness so complete that it looked like a medical condition. Trump sat in a chair and watched a monitor and said very little, and the people around him understood that the silence was not emptiness. It was calibration. The first question came from Brett Baer before the candidates had fully settled into their positions, and it was designed with the premeditated efficiency of a network that had decided the evening's most reliable source of television was the man at center stage, to create an immediate confrontation between Trump and the Republican Party he was seeking to lead. Bear asked the 10 candidates on the stage to raise their hand if they were unwilling to pledge support to the eventual Republican nominee and to rule out an independent run. One hand went up. It was Trump's. He raised it without hesitation and without the flicker of social discomfort that the gesture's isolation might have produced in a man more concerned with the approval of the people around him. And in that single raised hand, captured by every camera in the arena, transmitted simultaneously to 24 million television viewers, the largest audience for a primary debate in American political history, was the entire argument of his candidacy compressed into a physical gesture. He was not one of them. He had never been one of them. And the fact that they did not want him was not a vulnerability. It was the credential. The summer and fall of 2015 had produced a Republican primary that was, by almost every conventional measure, the most crowded and theoretically deep field the party had assembled in the modern era. Jeb Bush had entered with the advantages of a famous name, an established donor network worth over $100 million in super PAC commitments, and the endorsements of the party infrastructure that had spent the Obama years waiting for a restoration candidate who could translate Republican institutional memory into electoral success. Marco Rubio was young and eloquent, and represented, in the party establishment's aspirational self-image, the coalition-broadening future that demographic reality seemed to demand. Scott Walker had won 3 elections in a purple state and arrived with a record of conservative governance that primary voters were supposed to reward. Ted Cruz had built, with methodical intelligence and ideological consistency, the grassroots conservative infrastructure that conventional primary wisdom said was the determinative asset in a multi-candidate field. Against this assembly of credentials, the political professionals had constructed models of the race that gave Trump, at best, a ceiling of 25 to 30% of Republican primary voters, enough to sustain him through the early chaos of a crowded field, but insufficient, the models said, to survive the consolidation that would come when the field narrowed and the establishment coalesced around an acceptable alternative. The models were wrong, and they were wrong in ways that the modelers would spend years explaining and never fully accounting for, because the models were built on assumptions about Republican primary voters that the voters themselves were in the process of invalidating. The core conflict of the primary campaign was structural and unprecedented. Trump was running against the concept of the establishment itself, which meant that the normal mechanisms by which establishments defeat insurgents, withdrawal of donor support, negative advertising, coordinated opposition from party figures, the quiet pressure of institutional disapproval, were, in the specific political environment of 2015 and 2016, not merely ineffective but actively counterproductive. Every editorial board denunciation was content for the rallies. Every Republican elder's warning about the damage he was doing to the party was evidence, in the accounting of his supporters, that the party's elders were the people who needed to be damaged. The Bush campaign spent over $80 million in negative advertising during the primary season, and watched Bush's numbers move in the direction opposite to the one the spending was intended to produce, because the voters, who had already decided that Bush represented precisely what was wrong with the Republican Party, were not going to be persuaded to return to him by a television spot, however well produced. The anti-Trump infrastructure that the establishment eventually assembled, the Never Trump movement, the coordinated effort in the late primary states to deny him the delegate majority he needed for a first ballot nomination, arrived too late and with too little, because the people who might have built it earlier had spent 6 months waiting for him to collapse under the weight of statements that would have ended any previous candidacy, and had discovered that the weight did not accumulate in the way they expected. Trump's debate performances across the primary season were the tactical expression of a strategy so simple that its simplicity was itself a form of sophistication. He was the only person on the stage who was not performing competence for the audience's approval. Every other candidate on those stages was, to varying degrees, executing a debate preparation strategy, answering questions in ways designed to demonstrate command of policy, to avoid the opposition research landmines that the opposing campaigns had seeded, to project the kind of measured presidential temperament that the consultant class had identified as electorally essential. Trump was doing something different. He was having the conversation, which was not the same thing as executing a strategy, and the distinction was visible to audiences in ways that polling could measure, even if it could not fully explain. When Megyn Kelly asked him, at the Cleveland debate, about the derogatory comments he had made over the years about women, he interrupted her question to note that he had said those things about Rosie O'Donnell. And the audience laughed, and the laughter was not nervous or polite, but genuine and releasing, the laughter of people who recognized that the social contract of the debate format, the implicit agreement that candidates would answer the questions they were asked rather than the questions they wished they had been asked, had just been dissolved by a man who found the contract more amusing than binding. The revealing action that most completely illuminates Trump's character during the primary debates, the single decision that functions as a keyhole into his operating psychology, occurred not during a debate but in its aftermath, in the 48 hours following the Cleveland Forum, when his response to Megyn Kelly's questioning took a turn that most of his advisers believed would end his campaign. In a CNN interview the following day, Trump said of Kelly that, "You could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever." And the statement was immediately and widely interpreted as a reference to menstruation, a characterization Trump denied with the specific indignation of a man who had said exactly what he meant and was willing to absorb the social cost of having meant it while simultaneously declining to own the interpretation that the words most naturally produced. His senior advisor, Roger Stone, called him and told him, with the directness of a man who had survived enough political crises to recognize a fatal one, that the statement was going to end the campaign, that the women who were a necessary component of any general election coalition would not forgive it, that he needed to apologize or clarify in terms stronger than he had yet offered. Trump listened to this advice and did not take it. He escalated. He went on television and attacked Kelly directly and retweeted supporters who called her a bimbo, and appeared at a rally the following weekend where the crowd's response to the Kelly controversy was not revulsion but enthusiasm. The polls, taken the week after the statement, showed his support among Republican women had not declined. It had increased. This was the keyhole. A man who had learned, across the primaries preceding months, that the rules of political consequence that his advisers believed in were not operating in this environment, and who was willing to test that discovery at the moment of maximum risk because his own reading of his audience told him something different than the professionals' reading did, and because his own readings had been right when the professionals had been wrong often enough that he had stopped distinguishing between confidence and correctness. Chris Christie was the supporting figure, whose trajectory through the primary's middle months illuminated most clearly the gravitational mechanics of Trump's political orbit. Christie had entered the race as a credible establishment alternative, a governor with a prosecutorial directness that gave him a rhetorical register closer to Trump's than most of the field. He had competed in New Hampshire with particular intensity, investing the kind of ground-level retail time that the state's primary tradition demanded, and that Trump had largely declined to provide, and had achieved, in the final weeks before the New Hampshire vote, a momentum that suggested he might emerge as the establishment's consolidation candidate. Then came the debate in Manchester, the week before the primary, where Christie had performed the service, perhaps the most consequential single debate performance of the primary season, of destroying Marco Rubio's campaign by exposing the mechanical repetitiveness of Rubio's debate preparation in real time, forcing Rubio to repeat a rehearsed 25-second passage 4 times in the space of 10 minutes in a way that was visible as mechanical failure to every viewer in the room. Christie had won that exchange, destroyed his rival's momentum, and then watched New Hampshire voters reward him with a 6th-place finish that effectively ended his candidacy. He had burned his own house down to prevent his neighbors from surviving, and the beneficiary was Trump, who won New Hampshire by more than 19 points. Christie endorsed Trump 10 days later, becoming the first significant Republican figure to do so, and the endorsement had the quality of a calculation made with clarity. If you cannot beat the man who is reorganizing the political landscape, you can at least be the first person of consequence to acknowledge that the landscape has changed. His presence beside Trump at the endorsement press conference, standing behind him, slightly to his left, with the expression of a man absorbing the specific experience of having made an irreversible decision, was one of the primary's most photographed moments, and its images communicated something about the new political order that the primary's remaining candidates had not yet fully accepted. By March of 2016, the consolidation that the establishment had promised itself would come had come, but it had come too late and in the wrong direction. The field had narrowed to Trump, Cruz, and Rubio, and the narrowing had produced not the anti-Trump coalition that the models had predicted, but a clarification of Trump's dominance that the plurality-based delegate allocation rules of the Republican primary system rewarded with mathematical efficiency. He was winning states he was not supposed to be competitive in. He was winning demographic groups, self-identified Republicans, evangelical Christians, voters without college degrees, that the conventional wisdom had assigned to other candidates. The establishment's emergency response, the investment of tens of millions in anti-Trump super PAC advertising, the extraordinary public interventions of Mitt Romney and John McCain, the coordinated effort to deny him delegates through procedural maneuvering, produced the air of a rescue operation conducted after the ship had already sunk, driven by people who could not quite believe the water was real. Cruz stayed in the longest, competing through Indiana on the theory that a contested convention in Cleveland might produce a different outcome than the primary voting had. And Trump ended that theory on the night of May 3rd when he won Indiana by 17 points, and Cruz withdrew from the race, and Kasich withdrew the following day, and the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and Eisenhower and Reagan, the party whose establishment had dismissed him with such confidence 11 months earlier on the afternoon of the escalator, was his. He gave a speech in Trump Tower that evening that was, by his standards, restrained, gracious toward Cruz in the specific way that a man who has just destroyed his opponent's presidential ambitions can afford to be gracious, forward-looking in the language that convention demanded, careful in the way that a man who has spent 11 months being deliberately incautious can be careful when caution serves his purpose. The general election was ahead. Hillary Clinton was, by all indications, going to be the Democratic nominee. And somewhere in the infrastructure of the Russian government, in the signals intelligence agencies and the hacking operations and the social media influence campaigns that American intelligence analysts were beginning to track with growing alarm, a set of decisions had already been made about the American presidential election that none of the people celebrating in the Trump Tower lobby that night, not Trump, not his family, not his advisors, not the supporters whose signs and cheers had propelled him across 17 primaries to this moment had been told about, and whose eventual revelation would consume the presidency that was now, for the first time, something more than a performance. Chapter 54. The Mass Rally as a Medium. The arena in Birmingham, Alabama, held approximately 18,000 people, and by the time Trump's advance team had finished its assessment in November of 2015, the line outside was already longer than the venue could accommodate. This was becoming a logistical pattern rather than an anomaly, The overflow crowds, the people who had driven 3 and 4 hours and would stand in a parking lot to hear the audio feed rather than leave, the local law enforcement requests for additional personnel that arrived in the days before each event with a frequency that suggested the advance team's crowd projections were being consistently exceeded. Inside, the configuration was what it always was: the floor standing, the lower bowl standing, the upper sections seated. The area directly behind the stage reserved for the crowd that would appear on camera over Trump's shoulder and whose composition therefore mattered as a visual argument. Trump arrived from the back, through the concourse, and the sound that greeted his emergence onto the stage was not applause in the conventional sense, not the rhythmic, directed clapping of a political crowd responding to an entrance, but something closer to the sound an arena makes when the home team takes the field in a playoff game, which is to say a sound that is partly about the person arriving and mostly about what has been building in the room before the person arrived, the accumulated pressure of the waiting finally finding its release. The media and political infrastructure of 2015 was organized around a set of assumptions about how political campaigns worked that had been built, iteratively and expensively, over 50 years of television-era presidential politics. The assumptions were that a campaign required a message developed through polling and focus groups, refined by communications professionals, and distributed through paid media, television advertisements primarily, that reached voters in their homes through channels that the campaign purchased and controlled. The assumptions further held that the credibility of the campaign's message was partially dependent on the credibility of the media channels through which it traveled, that an endorsement from a major newspaper or a favorable story in a prestige outlet carried a legitimacy-conferring function that paid advertising could not replicate, and that the campaign's relationship with the press corps was therefore a strategic resource requiring active management. The entire profession of political consulting, the pollsters, the media buyers, the communications directors, the opposition researchers, the debate coaches, existed to execute these assumptions at the highest possible level of sophistication. And the campaigns that won presidential primaries were, in the standard model, the campaigns that executed them best. Trump's campaign was not executing these assumptions. It was ignoring them, not through negligence but through a theory, implicit, never formally articulated by the candidate himself, but structurally present in every decision the campaign made or declined to make, that the assumptions were wrong in a specific way. They were correct about the destination, voter persuasion, turnout, the construction of a majority coalition, but wrong about the vehicle. The professional political model assumed that the campaign was the vehicle, that the apparatus of consultants and paid media and press management existed to carry the candidate's message to the voter. Trump's model inverted the relationship. The candidate was the vehicle. The message was distributed not through channels that the campaign purchased or managed, but through the candidate's own media presence, the rallies, the Twitter account, the cable news appearances that networks provided without charge because Trump's segments generated ratings, and that Trump therefore received as a subsidy worth, by some analysts' calculations, hundreds of millions of dollars in equivalent advertising value. The core conflict embedded in this model was one of control, specifically the tension between the liberation that the model provided and the vulnerability it created. A campaign that distributes its message through purchased media controls what the message says, when it says it, and to whom it is directed. A campaign whose message distribution runs through the candidate's unmediated personality, through rally speeches delivered without teleprompters, through tweets composed and sent without communications review, through cable news appearances that could go in any direction the interviewer or the candidate's own associations might take them, is a campaign that is perpetually one improvisation away from a statement that redefines the race in ways the campaign did not choose and cannot contain. Every political professional who observed the Trump campaign from the outside, and several who attempted to influence it from the inside, identified this as the campaign's fundamental operational risk, that the mechanism that generated its advantages was identical with the mechanism that generated its most dangerous moments, and that there was no way to capture one without accepting the other. Trump understood this. He accepted it not as a compromise, but as a feature, as evidence that the model worked precisely because it could not be fully managed, because the unmanageability was itself the source of the authenticity that the audience was responding to. The rally as a medium deserves analysis on its own terms, because the Trump rally of 2015 and 2016 was a genuinely novel political form, not merely a large campaign event, but a total sensory environment designed through a combination of deliberate staging and organic development to produce a specific emotional experience that the audience understood correctly as unavailable anywhere else. The music choices were significant. The classic rock and pop that preceded Trump's entrance, songs whose cultural associations were with a specific era of American life, the 1970s and 1980s, the period whose economic confidence and cultural coherence the campaign's entire message was organized around recovering, created an emotional precondition in the crowd before Trump appeared. The physical scale of the venues communicated, in the language of crowd size, as a social proof mechanism, that the movement was real and large and growing, which encouraged individuals in the audience to understand their presence not as a consumer choice, "I attended this political event," but as a participation in something consequential. And Trump's performance within this environment, the improvisational speaking, the departures from any prepared text, the call and response structures that the crowd learned and anticipated, the nicknames and the catchphrases that accumulated across rallies, and that created a shared vocabulary between the candidate and the audience, generated a feedback loop of mutual recognition that political scientists studying the rallies described, in terms that carried some discomfort about their implications, as characteristic of identity-based political movements rather than conventional electoral coalitions. The Twitter dimension of the communication strategy was, in its operational mechanics, a complement to the rally rather than a separate channel. What the rally did for the people in the arena, the direct, unmediated, unfiltered communication from the candidate to the audience, bypassing the interpretive layer of the press, Twitter did for the people who were not there. Trump's account, which he managed personally, and which his communications staff did not consistently review before tweets were sent, functioned as a rolling, real-time extension of the rally voice. The same register, the same rhythms, the same mixture of self-promotion and grievance and attack that the arena crowds received in acoustic form delivered instead in text to a following that would grow over the course of the campaign into the tens of millions. The press covered the tweets as events. Each controversial or unexpected posting generated its own news cycle, its own round of cable news analysis, its own secondary amplification through the social media responses of the people who agreed and the people who objected. And the coverage provided, again, the distribution subsidy that a conventional campaign would have paid for and that Trump received as a consequence of his media mastery. The tweet was covered. The coverage reached people who did not follow Trump. The coverage, whether favorable or critical, transmitted the message. The revealing action of this period involves a decision that Trump made about a specific rally moment that his staff had identified as potentially problematic and had brought to his attention. At a rally in November of 2015 in Birmingham, the same arena, the same overflow crowds, a Black Lives Matter protester who had interrupted the event was surrounded by supporters and physically removed in a manner that cameras captured and that generated significant news coverage. Trump's response, when asked about the incident the following morning on Fox News, was to observe that maybe the protester should have been roughed up, delivered in the tone of a man making a reasonable observation about a situation whose logic he found self-evident. His staff, aware that the comment would be replayed and contextualized, and would generate the kind of coverage that a professional political communications operation would characterize as damaging, suggested softening the characterization. Trump did not soften it. His calculation, never stated explicitly but present in the behavioral evidence, was that the softening would cost more than the comment, because the comment was resonant with the portion of his audience that experienced the disruption of political events as a form of illegitimate silencing, and that a candidate who retreated from a provocative statement under media pressure was a candidate who had just demonstrated exactly the weakness that his entire campaign was organized against. The comment was left to stand. The coverage generated a news cycle that critics characterized as evidence of the campaign's dangerous register. The polls that week, as in previous weeks, continued to move in Trump's direction. The figure whose relationship with Trump most illuminates the communication strategy of this period is Hope Hicks, who had joined the campaign in its earliest days as a press assistant, and who would become, over the course of the 2015 and 2016 campaign, the primary conduit between Trump and the press corps. Hicks was 26 years old when she joined the campaign, had no previous political experience, and had come to Trump's orbit through her work for a public relations firm that handled Trump family accounts. What she brought to the role, and what made her more effective as a Trump press liaison than several of the more experienced political communications professionals who cycled through the campaign, was an understanding of Trump's communication instincts that was not theoretical but observational, built through proximity. She had watched him interact with press enough to understand what he was doing when he was doing it, what he was optimizing for, what he considered success, how he processed negative coverage, and why he processed it differently than conventional political wisdom suggested he should. She did not attempt to manage him in the way that political communications professionals manage candidates, which is to say, she did not attempt to substitute her judgment about what he should say for his judgment about what he wanted to say. She managed the relationship between his communication and the press corps, the logistics, the access, the information flow, in ways that kept the relationship functional without constraining the candidate. Trump trusted her in the specific way he trusted people who did not attempt to change what he fundamentally was, and the trust gave her an influence over the campaign's communications environment that her formal position and her relative inexperience did not obviously predict. By the end of 2015, the rally infrastructure and the Twitter operation had together accomplished something that the political class was still struggling to fully accept. They had created a campaign that was, by the metrics of earned media, name recognition, and primary polling, the leading campaign in the Republican field, operating at a fraction of the cost of its nearest competitors and without the professional apparatus that conventional wisdom held to be a prerequisite for competitive viability. Bush's super PAC had raised $100 million. Trump had spent a fraction of that, had purchased almost no television advertising, and was polling ahead of Bush by margins that were not within the range of statistical noise. The lesson that the numbers were teaching, that the professional political infrastructure's value rested on assumptions about voter reach and message credibility that Trump's media platform had made obsolete for a candidate with his specific characteristics, was a lesson that the political class was receiving in real time and processing with the difficulty that all institutions experience when their foundational assumptions are challenged by evidence that cannot be explained within the existing framework. What the rally infrastructure and the Twitter operation were also accomplishing, less visibly and with consequences that extended beyond the campaign, was the construction of a direct relationship between a political figure and a mass audience that bypassed the institutional mediators, the press, the party, the professional political class, whose function in American democracy had been in part to maintain the standards of conduct and the norms of discourse that gave the political system its stability. Trump's audiences understood that he was speaking to them without filtering, and they valued this understanding. and the value they placed on it was not contingent on the accuracy of every claim he made or the specifics of every policy he proposed. It was contingent on the experience of directness itself, the sense of a man saying what he thought, taking the consequences and continuing to say it. This experience, powerful and genuine in the emotional register it occupied, was also, and this is what the most attentive observers of the rallies were beginning to understand by the end of 2015, systematically eroding the credibility of the institutional structures whose validity depended on the audience's belief that those structures deserved their role as intermediaries, and the erosion, once sufficiently advanced, would prove extraordinarily difficult to reverse regardless of what any subsequent election produced. Chapter 55. The Cleveland Coronation. The smoke machine was running too hot, and someone in the production crew knew it, and was doing the calculation that production crews do in the final seconds before something begins. Fix it now, and risk the delay, or let it run, and trust that the visual effect, the billowing theatrical vapor through which the presumptive Republican nominee would walk onto the stage to introduce his wife on the convention's opening night, would register as intentional grandeur rather than accidental excess. They let it run. And when Donald Trump walked out of that smoke on the evening of July 18, 2016, into the roar of the Quicken Loans Arena crowd, and the blaze of the television lights, and the sight of 2,500 Republican delegates who had spent the preceding months variously fighting him and fearing him, and calculating the terms of their eventual accommodation with him, he paused at the edge of the stage for a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer, a man standing in manufactured fog, at the center of something he had imagined for decades, taking the temperature of the room with the practiced accuracy of a performer who has never in his professional life walked onto a stage without knowing exactly what it was going to give him. The convention was his. The party was his. Both facts were simultaneously true, and still, for those 3 seconds in the smoke, slightly incredible. The Republican National Convention of 2016 was taking place inside a set of contradictions so profound that the physical space of the Quicken Loans Arena seemed at moments insufficient to contain them. The party gathering in Cleveland was, by every institutional measure, the least unified major party convention in a generation. 50 Republican members of Congress had declined to attend. Both living Republican former presidents, George W. Bush and his father, were absent, their silence a statement of sufficient eloquence that it required no accompanying words. The Platform Committee had produced a document that bore little relationship to the policy positions of most of the party's congressional delegation. The Never Trump movement, which had spent the final months of the primary season attempting to engineer a rules change that would free delegates from their commitments on the first ballot, had been defeated in the Rules Committee by a margin sufficient to end the procedural fight, but not large enough to silence the bitterness that had produced it. The convention manager, Paul Manafort, was managing a floor operation that required constant monitoring for defections, maintaining a count that everyone involved knew was sufficient, and that no one in the Trump operation entirely trusted until the roll call was done. Into this atmosphere of institutional fracture, Trump was preparing to introduce himself not merely as the nominee, but as the resolution, as the force that made the party's contradictions irrelevant by replacing them with something new, something that answered to a different principle of coherence than the one that had organized the Republican coalition since Reagan. The old coalition had been bound by the three-legged stool of fiscal conservatism, social conservatism, and muscular internationalism, a formula that the think tanks and the donor class and the party's congressional leadership had maintained across 4 decades with the confidence of men who had built something durable. Trump was proposing to replace it with something simpler, and he believed more honest, a nationalism of economic resentment and cultural solidarity, a politics organized not around policy positions, but around a shared feeling about who had been winning and who had been losing in the America of the preceding generation, and whose fault the losing was. Whether this new formula would hold together a coalition large enough to win a general election was the question that the convention was both raising and refusing to answer, because the convention's function was not to resolve doubts but to manufacture confidence, and the smoke machine running at the entrance to the stage was as accurate a symbol as any of what that manufacture required. The core conflict of the convention week was not primarily external. The procedural threats had been defeated, the nomination was secured, the floor operation was holding, but tonal and generational, a struggle over what kind of convention this would be, and what it would say about the party that Trump was inheriting and remaking simultaneously. The convention's planners, working under the direction of Manafort and the campaign's communications team, had conceived a 4-night program organized around the themes of security, work, faith, and the promise of a Trump presidency. The primetime speakers were a mixture of Trump family members, military and law enforcement figures, business associates, and a small number of elected officials willing to appear, a roster that reflected the party establishment's partial boycott and the Trump organization's partially deliberate preference for voices outside the political class. The tonal aspiration was optimistic nationalism, the kind of convention that told a story of American renewal through a Trump presidency. What emerged, particularly in the first 2 nights, was considerably darker. A keynote address by Rudy Giuliani that reached a pitch of rhetorical intensity that alarmed even some Trump supporters watching at home. A parade of speakers whose primary mode was grievance rather than aspiration. A convention atmosphere that critics described as angry and that its participants experienced as honest. The plagiarism crisis that erupted on the convention's opening night after Melania's speech. The discovery, within hours of her address, that several passages bore unmistakable resemblance to a 2008 Michelle Obama convention speech, produced the first genuine crisis of the week, and illuminated with uncomfortable clarity the operational culture of the campaign that was preparing to ask the country to trust it with the management of the federal government. The speechwriting process had been chaotic and last-minute in ways that the campaign's skeleton communications staff had not fully controlled, and the specific mechanism by which Michelle Obama's language had migrated into Melania Trump's speech, whether through deliberate borrowing by a writer who thought the phrases would not be recognized, or through the kind of research note confusion that can produce accidental transcription, was disputed and never definitively established. What was not disputed was the campaign's response, which cycled through denial and deflection and partial acknowledgement in the course of a single news cycle, with a lack of coordination that suggested an organization managing a crisis with insufficient infrastructure. Trump's own response was to minimize and redirect, to insist that the coverage was disproportionate, that Melania had given a beautiful speech, that the media's focus on the controversy was itself evidence of the bias he had been describing all year. The crisis faded within 48 hours, partly because conventions are high-information environments where each day's news displaces the previous day's with unusual speed, and partly because Trump had learned, across 12 months of primary campaigning, that crises that would have been terminal for conventional candidates were for him merely expensive weather, things to be stood in until they passed. The revealing action, the decision that functions as the clearest window into Trump's character at the convention's peak, was the acceptance speech itself, and specifically the choice of its emotional register. Presidential acceptance speeches, in the established grammar of the form, are aspirational documents. They acknowledge hardship and then overcome it rhetorically. They describe a country in difficulty and then summon its latent greatness. They are, at their core, love letters to the nation's self-image, calibrated to make the maximum number of voters feel seen and included and hopeful. Reagan's convention speeches had been masterclasses in this form. Obama's 2008 convention address had updated it for a new era. Even candidates who ran on change, who argued that things needed to be fundamentally different, had traditionally delivered the change message in the key of renewal rather than the key of emergency. Trump's speechwriters, working with the input of Stephen Miller, who had become one of the campaign's most influential voices on both policy and rhetoric, had produced a text that made a deliberate choice to foreground the emergency at the expense of the renewal. To spend the speech's considerable length, 75 minutes, the longest major party acceptance speech in modern history, in the register of crisis rather than the register of hope. "I alone can fix it" was the sentence that the press seized on, and that critics cited as evidence of authoritarian ambition. But the sentence existed within a speech whose entire architecture was built on the premise that the country was broken in ways the existing political class was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge, and that the acknowledgement itself, the willingness to say it plainly without the optimistic varnishing that political convention demanded, was the first and most essential act of genuine leadership. Whether this framing was strategically correct was a question the November election would answer. Whether it was sincere, whether Trump genuinely believed the picture of carnage and decline he was painting, was a question that those who knew him best answered in different ways. And the difference in their answers said something important about the distance between the man and the performance that even his closest observers had not yet finished navigating. Paul Manafort was the figure whose role at the convention illuminated both the campaign's institutional ambitions and its most serious vulnerability. Manafort had been brought into the campaign in the spring, when it became clear that the delegate operation required professional management, that the path to the nomination ran through rules committee fights and state convention maneuvering that demanded expertise the existing campaign staff did not possess. He was 67 years old, a Washington lobbyist and political consultant of long experience and significant reputation, whose client list over the preceding decades had included foreign governments and political figures whose relationships with American democratic values were, at best, complicated. His work for Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president who had been deposed in 2014, was publicly known in the political professional community and had generated some press attention, but had not yet been subjected to the investigative scrutiny that would eventually reveal the financial arrangements underlying it. Manafort arrived at the convention with the authority of a man who had delivered the nomination. The procedural fights had been won, the rules had held. The roll call was going to produce the number, and with the quiet confidence of someone who believed that his work in Cleveland was the beginning of a longer tenure rather than its peak. He was wrong about that, and the reasons he was wrong were already present, buried in financial records and foreign lobbying registrations and wire transfer documentation that federal investigators were in the process of beginning to examine, though the investigation's eventual reach and the destruction it would bring to Manafort personally were not visible in July 2016 to anyone seated in the Quicken Loans arena. The roll call of the states, conducted on the convention's second evening, had the quality of theater that everyone present understood was simultaneously genuine and scripted. Genuine because the delegate counts were real and the nomination was mathematically real. Scripted because the outcome had been known for weeks, and the drama of the state-by-state announcement was a performance of democratic process rather than its substance. When New York's delegation put Trump over the threshold, when the count crossed 1,237, and the arena erupted and the floor cameras found the Trump family in their box with expressions that varied from vindication to relief to the particular composure of people who have been trained to perform emotion rather than display it, there was a moment of collective recognition in the building that something had actually happened, that the improbable had arrived at its logical destination, that the party of Lincoln was going to be represented in a general election by a man who had never held public office, had never served in the military, had declared bankruptcy multiple times, had been married 3 times, had been a registered Democrat, and had spent the preceding years saying things that would have destroyed the campaigns of every previous Republican nominee while watching his own campaign grow stronger with each statement. Trump watched the roll call from a suite above the arena floor, returning to the hall after the threshold was crossed to stand with his family in the box and receive the arena's acknowledgement. His expression in those minutes was one of the most studied photographs of the convention week. A man looking at something he had been told for most of the preceding year he could not having it, and revealing in his face something that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but something more complicated and more private, the expression of a man whose relationship with his own ambitions was too long and too complicated to resolve into a simple emotion at the moment of their satisfaction. The acceptance speech came on the final night, and it lasted until nearly midnight. And when it was finished, and the balloons fell, and the family assembled on the stage, and the arena made the sounds that arenas make at the conclusion of these events, Trump stood at the podium for longer than was strictly necessary, and looked out at the crowd with an expression that had returned to its default setting, the composed, assessing, slightly remote expression of a man who is always, even at the moments of greatest personal achievement, watching the room as much as inhabiting it. The general election was 3.5 months away. Hillary Clinton's campaign, which had been running the kind of operation that conventional political science said was the determinative advantage, superior organization, superior funding, superior ground game, the structural benefits of a candidate who had been preparing for this race for most of a decade, was waiting. And somewhere, in the architecture of what was about to happen, in the email servers and the social media platforms and the intervention operations of a foreign government that had decided it had a preference, the forces were already in motion that would make the general election campaign the most scrutinized and the most contested and the most consequential in modern American history, though on the night of July 21, 2016, in the balloon-filled arena in Cleveland, the only thing that anyone in the Trump family's immediate orbit could be certain of was that they had come further than anyone had told them they could come, and that what came next was going to be unlike anything American politics had yet produced. Chapter 56. Strategic Balance. The suite at the Marriott Marquis in Indianapolis was quieter than Trump preferred, which was itself a diagnostic signal about the nature of what he was doing there. He had flown to Indiana in mid-July of 2016, ostensibly to appear at a fundraiser and to deliver remarks at an event that his campaign had characterized as routine. But the actual purpose of the trip, the meeting with Mike Pence at the governor's residence on North Meridian Street, the dinner afterward, the extended conversation that went longer than the schedule had allotted, was the most consequential personnel decision of his political life. And he was approaching it with a combination of genuine deliberation and visible reluctance that people close to him recognized as the specific register Trump occupied when he was being asked to make a choice that constrained his future options rather than expanding them. A running mate was not a hire he could reverse. A running mate was a statement, and the statement that Mike Pence represented was one that Trump understood with the clarity that his instincts provided when his instincts were functioning correctly, was necessary, and also limiting in ways that the necessity did not eliminate. The Republican National Convention was scheduled to begin in Cleveland on July 18, 2016, which gave Trump approximately 1 week from the Indiana visit to make the announcement and manage the rollout. The timing pressure was real, but it was not the pressure that was shaping the decision most forcefully. The pressure that was shaping it was the structural pressure of a general election campaign against Hillary Clinton, which Trump's newly installed campaign chairman Paul Manafort brought in after the departure of Corey Lewandowski in June, when the campaign's internal tensions had finally resolved in the direction of the professionals, had been analyzing with an attention to the Electoral College mathematics that the primary campaign's rally and Twitter model had not required. The primary had been won through a communication strategy that was, at its core, independent of traditional political infrastructure. The general election was a different problem. It required the mobilization of voters in specific states through organizational methods, voter registration, volunteer networks, get-out-the-vote operations that the campaign had not built. And it required the consolidation of a Republican coalition whose establishment wing had spent the previous year expressing, with varying degrees of public restraint, its profound discomfort with the nominee. The vice presidential selection was the instrument through which both problems could be partially addressed, and the instrument that most precisely addressed them was a Midwestern evangelical with deep relationships in the Congressional Republican caucus and a reputation for doctrinal conservatism so consistent it had become a kind of biographical identity. The America that surrounded this decision was in a condition of political polarization that the 2016 campaign had accelerated without originating. The Pew Research Center's tracking of partisan polarization showed that the distance between the median Democrat and the median Republican had grown more over the preceding 20 years than over the previous 50, measured by policy positions, cultural attitudes, and, most significantly for the dynamics Trump was navigating, by the simple metric of how negatively each partisan group viewed the other. The Republican coalition that Trump had won the primary with was not the Republican coalition that had nominated Romney in 2012 or McCain in 2008. It was older, less college-educated, more economically anxious, more culturally conservative in the specific sense of feeling that the cultural changes of the Obama years, on immigration, on social issues, on what they perceived as a systematic denigration of traditional American identity, had proceeded without their consent and against their interests. The evangelical Christian community, which overlapped substantially with this demographic but was not identical to it, had its own relationship to the Trump candidacy. They were drawn to his cultural conservatism and his Supreme Court implications, deeply uncertain about his personal biography, and in need of a signal that their specific concerns would have a voice in a Trump administration. Pence was that signal, compressed into a person and placed on a ticket. The core conflict of the vice presidential selection process was a conflict between Trump's instincts and his advisors' calculations, which is to say, it was a conflict that recurred throughout his campaign and his subsequent presidency, and that this particular decision brought into unusually sharp relief. Trump's instincts ran toward Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, who had been the first major Republican official to endorse him after his own candidacy collapsed, and toward Newt Gingrich, the former House Speaker whose combative intelligence and willingness to engage the press with aggressive counter-programming matched Trump's own communication style in ways that appealed to him. Christie had executive experience, a prosecutorial directness, and a loyalty to Trump that had been demonstrated publicly and under social cost, because the endorsement had exposed Christie to ridicule and to the damage of his own political standing in New Jersey. Gingrich had intellectual firepower and a familiarity with Washington's institutional machinery that Trump recognized as potentially useful, and their shared tendency to operate outside the boundaries of conventional political discourse created a compatibility that Trump found genuinely appealing. What Manafort and the campaign's strategic advisors were telling him, what the polling and the focus groups and the Electoral College modeling were telling him, with a consistency that the data enforced even when Trump pushed back against its conclusions, was that Christie carried New Jersey, which was not a competitive state, and carried the Bridgegate scandal, which was a competitive liability. Gingrich carried Georgia, which should not have been a competitive state, but in the specific dynamics of 2016 was showing unexpected movement, and carried a personal history, 3 marriages, an affair conducted during the Clinton impeachment proceedings that Gingrich was publicly leading, that complicated the campaign's outreach to the evangelical voters whose consolidation behind Trump was not yet complete. Pence carried Indiana, which was also not competitive, but Pence carried something more valuable than a state. He carried a relationship with the House Republican caucus built through his 6 years as a member of leadership, a relationship with the evangelical community built through a lifetime of explicit public identification with its values, and a reputation for personal probity and ideological consistency that functioned in the context of a Trump ticket as a kind of character certificate, a statement that the governing coalition, whatever one thought of the nominee's own biography, included people whose public lives had been conducted according to recognizable standards. The revealing action of the Pence selection is a phone call that Trump made to Pence in the final days of the deliberation, which multiple accounts have described in its essential outlines, if not its verbatim content. Trump called to probe, not to offer the position, or not only to offer it, but to test the quality of Pence's interest and the degree of his deference, because Trump's assessment of a potential associate began with those two variables and built outward from them. The conversation, by accounts that reached journalists through people familiar with it, was not brief. Trump talked. Pence listened. Trump raised the question of whether Pence could be comfortable in the role, comfortable with the dynamic, the pace, the communication style, the fact that a vice presidency in a Trump administration would be a different institutional experience than the post had offered previous occupants. Pence's response, in its substance and in its manner, communicated a willingness to subordinate his own political identity to the demands of the ticket and the requirements of the nominee that Trump registered as the correct answer. Whether Pence understood, in receiving the question and providing the answer, that he was passing a test whose terms would define the entire subsequent relationship, that the deference he was demonstrating in the call was the deference that would be expected indefinitely, that the subordination he was accepting was not a temporary posture but a structural condition, is a question that Pence's subsequent behavior suggests he may have understood incompletely. The figure whose role in the Pence selection was most decisive, in the sense of converting Trump's ambivalence into a commitment, was Ivanka Trump, whose judgment her father trusted in personnel matters with a consistency that was notable among the various forms of advice he received and variably discarded. Ivanka had met Pence, had assessed him in the specific way she assessed people, attending to the gap between what they presented publicly and what the private interaction suggested about their actual character, and had communicated to her father that Pence was genuine in the presentation, that the evangelical identity was not performance but conviction, and that conviction of that kind, whatever one thought of its content, was a reliable predictor of behavioral consistency. For Trump, who had spent a professional lifetime navigating people whose presented selves were strategic constructions, the assessment that Pence was who he appeared to be carried weight. The unpredictability that Trump introduced into every system he occupied was, as a governing strategy, most sustainable when surrounded by people whose predictability provided structural stability. Pence was predictably conservative, predictably deferential, predictably committed to the institutional norms of the vice presidency as a role that amplified the president's agenda rather than pursuing its own. This predictability was, from Trump's operational perspective, a feature rather than a limitation, at least as the arrangement was initially conceived. The announcement was scheduled for a Friday morning press conference in New York, following the convention timeline that Manafort had constructed. On the Thursday evening before the announcement, the news broke in France. A truck had driven into a Bastille Day crowd in Nice, killing 86 people and injuring hundreds more in an attack that the Islamic State would subsequently claim. Trump was informed and made the decision, consistent with his instinct, that the press conference framing served him less well in the context of a major international terrorist event than it had the previous day, to postpone. He posted a statement on Twitter. The announcement was delayed by a day, the press conference rescheduled, and the rollout that Manafort's team had choreographed was compressed and somewhat disrupted. Trump's response to the disruption, calm, pragmatic, focused on what the revised schedule required rather than on the deviation from the plan, was noted by people in the campaign as evidence of a flexibility that his public persona did not always suggest. He adjusted, moved forward, and appeared the following day with Pence at the Hilbert Circle Theater in Indianapolis with the photogenic configuration of a national ticket. The nominee and the running mate, their wives beside them, the flags behind them, the teleprompter in front of Trump bearing remarks that he read with less comfort than he spoke without them, but that the occasion's formality required. Pence's performance in the vice presidential debate against Tim Kaine in October would confirm the wisdom of the selection by at least one important metric. He was unflappable, prepared, and capable of articulating a conservative policy framework in complete sentences that parsed correctly under pressure, which provided a form of reassurance to voters uncertain about the ticket's governing competence that no Trump debate performance was designed to provide. The two men's styles were so comprehensively different. Trump extravagant, associative, contemptuous of prepared remarks. Pence disciplined, sequential, fluent in the language of institutional conservatism, that observers who noted the contrast sometimes framed it as evidence of incoherence in the ticket. The more accurate framing was complementarity. Each supplied what the other lacked. Each reached a portion of the coalition that the other could not efficiently reach, and the combination was more electorally effective in the specific conditions of 2016 than either would have been alone. What the selection could not resolve, and what its architects did not fully reckon with in the pressure of the pre-convention week, was the fundamental asymmetry between what Trump wanted from Pence and what Pence wanted from Trump. Trump wanted consolidation, evangelical votes, congressional relationships, the signal to the Republican establishment that the nominee was governable, that the coalition he was assembling had room for people whose political identity was rooted in institutional conservatism rather than populist disruption. Pence wanted proximity to power, and the influence that proximity provided, the opportunity to shape a conservative governing agenda from the position of someone the president trusted, and the political future that a successful vice presidency would make available. These wants were compatible in the short term, and the ticket that emerged from Indianapolis and from the Cleveland Convention was, in the specific electoral conditions of 2016, a sufficient instrument. What the compatibility concealed was the degree to which its maintenance depended on conditions. A successful administration, a shared understanding of constitutional obligation, an agreement about the limits of loyalty that the future would test in ways that the July afternoon in Indiana had given neither man full reason to anticipate. The convention in Cleveland proceeded with the controlled chaos that had become the Trump campaign's signature operational register, and the nominee who took the stage on the final evening to accept the Republican Party's presidential nomination was not the candidate that the party's establishment had sought or expected or prepared for. And the speech he delivered, dark in its assessment of the country's condition, maximalist in its promised remedies, organized around a theory of personal authority that the conventions of presidential acceptance addresses had never previously hosted in quite this form, announced, to anyone paying sufficiently close attention, that the instrument the party had allowed to be assembled in its name was not a conventional instrument, and that the uses to which it would be put in the months and years ahead had not been fully imagined by the people who had, for reasons of calculation and necessity, agreed to stand beside it. Chapter 57. General Election Debates. He was already at the podium when she walked out, which was not the agreed protocol, and those who knew him understood that this was not an accident. The stage at Hofstra University on the evening of September 26, 2016, had been configured with the geometric precision that presidential debate stagecraft required. Two podiums, separated by a distance, calibrated to feel simultaneously competitive and civil, a moderator's desk at the front, an audience of 500, selected with the political balance that the Commission on Presidential Debates maintained, with the scrupulousness of a Switzerland determined to offend no one. Trump had arrived at his podium early and stood behind it with his hands resting on its surface in the posture that had become, across 14 seasons of television and 17 months of campaigning, one of the most recognizable physical signatures in American public life. He watched Hillary Clinton cross the stage toward her podium with the particular quality of attention he brought to any situation he was about to compete in, assessing, categorizing, filing. And when she reached her position and turned to face the audience, he nodded at her with a minimal courtesy that contained, in its minimalism, the precise amount of respect he had decided the moment required and not a molecule more. 84 million people were watching. It was the largest audience for a presidential debate in American history. He had spent the preceding weeks preparing for this evening in the specific way that Donald Trump prepared for things, by insisting to his advisers that he did not need preparation, absorbing information in the unstructured conversational mode that his mind processed best, and then arriving at the event with the confidence of a man who had decided that authenticity was a better strategy than rehearsal, which in his case it may well have been. To understand the debates of the 2016 general election, 3 of them, spread across 6 weeks between September and October, each one watched by audiences that dwarfed the viewership of any primary debate, one must understand the specific political geography of the autumn in which they occurred, and the precise nature of the choice that the American electorate was being asked to make. Hillary Clinton was, by every metric of conventional political preparedness, the most qualified major party presidential candidate in decades. Former First Lady, former Senator from New York, former Secretary of State, a woman who had spent 40 years in and around the mechanics of American governance and who understood its procedures and its personnel and its institutional memory with a depth that no presidential candidate since George H.W. Bush could match. She had prepared for the debates with a thoroughness that her team described with justifiable pride as comprehensive. Mock debates, policy briefings, psychological profiles of Trump's debate tendencies, an analytical framework for anticipating his interruptions and redirections and personal attacks. She was, entering Hofstra, the most prepared debater on the most prepared campaign in the history of the Democratic primary process. Trump was preparing for the debates in 2016 in an America that had been living with economic anxiety for nearly a decade, in which the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis had produced growth that was statistically real but experientially absent for a substantial portion of the electorate, in which the opioid epidemic was advancing through communities that the political class was only beginning to measure, in which the sense that the country's institutions, financial, political, journalistic, had failed their constituents in fundamental ways, and had then failed to account for those failures, was generating a political energy that no conventional candidate was positioned to channel. Clinton's policy platform was detailed and substantive, and largely continuous with the democratic governance of the preceding 8 years, which was precisely its problem. It was addressed to the world as the professional political class understood it, and a significant portion of the electorate had concluded that the professional political class did not understand the world they were living in. Trump's platform was thinner and more theatrical, but addressed something the policy platform did not: the feeling, specific and powerful and politically underestimated, that the people running things had contempt for the people the things were supposed to serve, and that what was required was not better management of the existing order, but someone willing to say, plainly, and without the hedging that institutional self-preservation demanded, that the existing order had failed. The core conflict of the debate series was structural, and for Trump's team, nearly insoluble on conventional terms. The debate format, 90 minutes of extended policy exchange, moderated by journalists whose professional formation inclined them toward the kind of substantive follow-up questioning that rewarded preparation, was designed, however unintentionally, to favor exactly the kind of candidate Clinton was, and to penalize exactly the kind of candidate Trump was. He did not have command of policy detail in the depth that the format seemed to demand. His answers to specific questions about his tax plan, or his healthcare alternative, or his foreign policy doctrine, had the character of propositions rather than programs, gestures toward a direction of travel rather than maps of the route. Clinton could speak to the mechanics of the Affordable Care Act or the structure of the Iran nuclear agreement with a fluency rooted in direct participation in their creation, and in a format that rewarded this fluency. She had an advantage that no debate preparation strategy could fully eliminate. The question for Trump was not how to match her on these terms, but how to make these terms irrelevant, how to ensure that the 90 minutes of debate registered in the living rooms and bars and dorm rooms where 84 million people were watching, as something other than the substantive policy comparison that the format was designed to produce. His answer, developed not through formal strategy sessions but through the instinctive refinement of a man who had been reading rooms professionally for 40 years, was to treat the debate as a different kind of performance than the one his opponent had prepared for. While Clinton was answering questions, Trump was performing a relationship with the audience, with the television audience, not the 500 people in the Hofstra auditorium, that was organized around a single proposition, that the woman at the other podium, however fluent and however prepared, was the living embodiment of a system that had failed the people watching, and that his willingness to stand on the same stage with her and say so was itself the most important thing that either of them could communicate in 90 minutes. He interrupted her. He paced behind her during the town hall format of the second debate, a physical choice that his team had not specifically planned, and that the post-debate conversation would analyze for days. He deployed nicknames that had the quality of folk art, Crooked Hillary, investing them with enough repetition that they had become, in the political vocabulary of his supporters, shorthand for an entire argument about institutional corruption that would have required paragraphs to make explicit. He answered questions about his tax returns and his businesses and his comments about women with a directness that acknowledged the attack while simultaneously redirecting its energy, not defending his record, but attacking the premise that his record was the relevant subject, insisting that the relevant subject was always in every exchange what she had done rather than what he had said. The anecdote that most clearly illuminates his character during the debate series, the decision that functions as the keyhole into his operating psychology at its most audacious, involves the preparation session that he permitted his team to conduct in the days before the first debate, a session at which Rudy Giuliani played the role of mock moderator, and several advisors attempted to walk Trump through the kinds of exchanges they anticipated the evening would produce. The session lasted less than an hour. Trump's patience with the format of mock preparation, with the simulation of an event he believed he understood better than any simulation could capture, expired before the session's architects had completed the first cycle of planned exchanges, and he said, with the directness he brought to all expressions of institutional impatience, that he had been doing this for 30 years, that he knew how to handle a stage, and that the preparation they were offering him was preparation for a kind of debate that he was not planning to have. He left the session and went to a rally. The rally was preparation of a different kind, a reading of his audience, a calibration of the themes and the phrases, and the emotional temperatures that his supporters responded to most powerfully, and it was preparation he trusted more than the mock debate, because it was real rather than simulated, because it told him things about the electorate that policy briefings could not tell him, because it confirmed, as every rally had confirmed across 17 months of campaigning, that the connection between himself and his supporters operated at a frequency that existed below the level of policy argument and above the level of traditional political messaging, in a register where authenticity and grievance and the performance of contempt for the contemptuous were the primary currencies. Steve Bannon had joined the campaign as its chief executive in mid-August, following the departure of Paul Manafort, and his influence on the debate strategy, such as it was a strategy rather than an improvisation conducted at the highest possible stakes, was most visible in the decision, before the second debate, at Washington University in St. Louis, to hold a press conference in the debate venue with women who had accused Bill Clinton of sexual misconduct. The press conference was scheduled for 90 minutes before the debate and was attended by cameras from every network covering the campaign, and it was, by the measure of sheer audacity as a political maneuver, something without precedent in the modern history of presidential debates. The goal was to place the Clinton campaign in an impossible position, to make the debate's pre-game conversation about the former president's conduct rather than the Access Hollywood tape that had dropped 48 hours earlier, in which Trump's recorded comments about groping women had produced the most severe crisis of the general election campaign and had led over the preceding weekend to a cascade of Republican elected officials withdrawing their endorsements and pronouncing the campaign finished. Bannon's instinct, which Trump had embraced with the enthusiasm of a man who recognized in it the same logic he had been applying to adversarial situations his entire life, was that the only response to an overwhelming attack was a more overwhelming counterattack, that the defense was always weaker than the offense, and that the best way to survive the Access Hollywood tape was to make the debate about something that put the Clintons rather than Trump on the defensive. Whether the maneuver succeeded in its intended purpose was a question that analysts debated for weeks afterward. What it demonstrated, without ambiguity, was the operating principle that governed Trump's engagement with crisis: escalate, never retreat, and trust that the audience's appetite for conflict would find the spectacle more compelling than the accusation it was designed to obscure. The relationship between Trump and Kellyanne Conway, who had replaced Manafort as campaign manager in the same mid-August reorganization that brought Bannon in, was the supporting dynamic that most directly shaped the debate's character and their aftermath. Conway was a pollster by formation and a political communicator by practice, and she brought to the campaign's final months a discipline and a media fluency that the earlier operation had lacked. She was, in the specific function of translating Trump's instincts into a general election message that could survive contact with the broader electorate, the most effective communicator in the campaign's orbit, able to appear on television and explain what Trump had said in terms that acknowledged the controversy without conceding the damage, able to maintain, under questioning that would have broken a less composed operator, the calm certainty of someone who believed the argument she was making even when the argument was difficult to make. Her relationship with Trump was not the relationship of a manager who managed her candidate in any conventional sense. He was not a candidate who was managed, and Conway understood this with the clarity of a professional who had worked with enough difficult principles to know which battles were worth fighting. She managed the presentation. She managed the surrogates. She managed the interaction between the campaign's message and the media environment in which it had to survive. She did not manage Trump, and she did not pretend to, and this was precisely why their relationship worked where others had failed. The third debate, at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, on October 19th, produced the exchange that would outlast all others in the historical record of the series. The moment when moderator Chris Wallace asked Trump whether he would accept the results of the election if he lost, and Trump replied, after a pause that contained something that was either deliberation or performance or both, that he would keep you in suspense. The political class's response was immediate and uniform in its alarm. The refusal of a major party nominee to commit to accepting electoral defeat was, in the vocabulary of American democratic tradition, a statement so far outside the established norms of the form that its implications took days to fully process. Clinton called it horrifying. Republican elected officials issued statements distancing themselves from the position. The debate analysts, scoring the evening's exchanges, treated it as the defining moment of the night and the most consequential statement of the debate series. Trump's supporters, watching the same exchange, heard something different. Not a threat to democratic norms, but a refusal to surrender in advance, a rejection of the rigged game narrative that the campaign had been constructing across months. A statement that their candidate was fighting for them in a system that had always been designed to defeat people like them, and was not going to simply accept that system's verdict on its own terms. The distance between those two receptions, between what the political class heard and what Trump's constituency heard, was not merely a gap in interpretation. It was a map of the country that the election, 3 weeks away, was about to reveal in a form that no poll and no debate scorecard and no gathering of pundits in a television studio had yet fully rendered. And the rendering, when it came, was going to rewrite everything that American politics thought it knew about itself. Chapter 58. Tabloid Turmoil. The call came in on a Friday afternoon, and the person who took it understood within the first 30 seconds that the weekend was over before it had begun. It was October 7, 2016, and the Washington Post's David Fahrenthold was calling the Trump campaign with the specific courtesy of a reporter who has something and is offering the subject a window to respond before publication. A window measured not in days but in minutes. The tape, Fahrenthold explained, was from 2005, recorded on a hot microphone on an Access Hollywood bus during a segment that had never aired, and it contained Donald Trump's voice, unmistakable and unambiguous, describing in graphic and specific terms his approach to women, the language casual and the content devastating. A man speaking without apparent awareness that he was being recorded in a way that compressed 11 years of tabloid innuendo and legal dispute and carefully managed public presentation into a single minute of audio that could not be explained away, contextualized into acceptability, or survived by any conventional political calculus. The campaign's senior staff absorbed the information with the specific quality of stillness that precedes institutional panic. And then the panic arrived, and it was thorough. Trump was at Trump Tower when the tape dropped publicly at 4 in the afternoon, released simultaneously by the Washington Post and NBC News. And the eruption that followed had a quality that even those who had lived through the previous 16 months of managed crisis had not prepared themselves for. This was different. The Republican elected officials, who had been maintaining their endorsements through the birther years, and the Mexican rapist's comment, and the Megyn Kelly blood statement, and the Gold Star family dispute, and the mock disability impression, and the accumulated catalog of statements that had each been pronounced fatal and each been survived. They had been maintaining those endorsements on the implicit theory that a line existed somewhere beyond which Trump would not go, or beyond which the political cost of continued association would exceed the political cost of withdrawal. The Access Hollywood tape located that line for a significant portion of them with the precision of a surveyor's instrument, and the withdrawals began within hours and continued through the weekend with the cascading momentum of a structure whose load-bearing elements have simultaneously failed. The political environment of October 2016 was already operating at a tension that made the tape's impact difficult to fully separate from the ambient conditions that surrounded it. The campaign had 31 days remaining. The polling, which had been tightening in the weeks after the first debate, showed Clinton ahead in most national surveys by margins that the campaign's internal modeling suggested were surmountable if the composition of the electorate matched what Trump's team believed it would be. If the voters who had not participated in recent elections but who attended his rallies in the numbers that the rallies consistently produced actually appeared at the polls in November. This theory of the electorate was contested by every professional polling organization and most of the political science community, but it was held with genuine conviction by the campaign's analytics team and with the absolute conviction of a man who trusted what he could see and feel in a room over what he could read in a survey. Trump had watched the rallies build across 16 months, had felt the specific energy of crowds that were not merely enthusiastic in the conventional political sense, but something more urgent and more personal, and had concluded from that feeling that the models were wrong about who was going to vote and how many of them there were. Whether this conclusion was correct was going to be answered on November 8th. Whether the tape had changed the calculations so fundamentally that the question was no longer worth asking was what the weekend of October 7th was forcing him to determine. The core conflict of this chapter, the central hurdle of the campaign's final month, was not the tape itself, which was a fixed and irreversible fact, but the decision it forced upon Trump in the hours and days immediately following its release. Whether to execute the conventional crisis management that every political professional in his orbit was urging, which involved a full and unqualified apology, a period of visible contrition, a pivot to the policy arguments that might allow wavering voters to return to him over the remaining weeks, or whether to treat the tape, as he had treated every previous crisis, as an attack to be absorbed and redirected rather than a wound to be dressed. The conventional crisis management argument was made with genuine urgency by people who understood campaigns, by Kellyanne Conway, who had the polling to demonstrate what the tape was doing to his numbers among college-educated women and suburban Republicans, and by Reince Priebus, the Republican National Committee chairman, who was watching the party's Senate candidates calculate their survival odds and making calls that made his own position uncomfortably clear. The alternative argument was made by a smaller group, by Bannon, by his family, by Trump's own reading of what his supporters required from him, and it was not, in its construction, an argument for ignoring the tape's damage. It was an argument about which kind of damage was survivable and which was not. An apology that the base experienced as a capitulation might cost more votes than the tape itself. Trump issued a statement within hours of the tape's release that represented, for him, something genuinely unusual, an acknowledgement that the words were wrong. The statement described the comments as locker room talk, a framing that was immediately contested, and expressed regret in language that was notably more direct than his typical response to controversy, which usually involved denial or counterattack before any acknowledgement of error. Those who watched him deliver a video statement, brief, controlled, the teleprompter visible in the reflection of his eyes, noted that he looked like a man performing contrition rather than experiencing it, which may have been accurate, and also like a man who had calculated precisely how much contrition the moment required and had delivered it in that quantity and not more, which was certainly accurate. The statement then pivoted to Bill Clinton, attacking the former president's conduct toward women with a directness that signaled to everyone watching that the contrition portion of the crisis response was complete and the counterattack portion was beginning. The pivot came within the same statement, before the statement had finished. The contrition lasted approximately 90 seconds of a 2-minute video. It was, by the standards of political crisis management, the most compressed apology-to-attack ratio in the modern history of the form. The anecdote that most completely illuminates Trump's character during this period, the keyhole through which his operating psychology at maximum pressure becomes fully legible, involves the phone calls he made in the hours after the tape dropped, before the statement was recorded, when the campaign was still in the raw assessment phase, and the options were being discussed with the urgency of people who understood that the decisions made in the next 4 hours were going to determine whether the campaign survived the weekend. He called several people. He called Rudy Giuliani, who had been a consistent voice for aggressive response throughout the campaign. He called his children, whose counsel he had sought at intervals throughout the race. And the substance of those calls, as reconstructed by people who were told of their contents, revealed a man who was less interested in the advice being offered than in the temperature-taking, in understanding, through the reactions of people he trusted, whether the tape had changed the fundamental terrain of the race or merely its weather. He was asking, not what should I do, but is this survivable? And the people who knew him well enough to read the question understood that he had already formed his own answer and was testing it against theirs. The answer he had formed was yes, and the basis for it was not optimism or denial, but the same empirical reading of his electorate that had sustained him through every previous crisis, that the people who had decided to vote for Donald Trump had not decided to vote for a moral exemplar but for a disruptive force, and that a disruptive force was not destroyed by evidence that it was disruptive. The relationship between Trump and his daughter Ivanka during the Access Hollywood Week illuminates with particular clarity the complexity of the family's role in the campaign and in his decision-making more broadly. Ivanka had been, across the campaign, the figure most associated with the effort to expand his appeal beyond the base. Her convention speech had been one of the few genuinely well-reviewed moments of the Cleveland gathering, and her public role had been constructed around the presentation of a candidate who was, despite his rhetoric, genuinely concerned with the economic advancement of working women and families. The tape was, for this effort, a catastrophic complication, and those who spoke with Ivanka during that weekend described a woman managing multiple simultaneous obligations. Her role as her father's advocate, her role as a businesswoman with her own brand, and her own relationships with the corporate partners the tape was causing to reconsider those relationships, and her role as a daughter processing something personal and painful about a recording that was not abstract but was her father's voice saying things that required her to find some response that served all of these obligations simultaneously. She did not withdraw from public life during the crisis. She did not issue a statement of distance or condemnation. She continued to appear on his behalf, her public presentation maintained with the discipline that had always characterized her navigation of the space between her own identity and her father's, and the maintenance cost her something that was visible to those watching carefully, in the precision with which she controlled what her face communicated and what it did not. The days between the tape's release and the second debate at Washington University in St. Louis were among the most consequential 72 hours in the campaign's history, because what happened in them determined not merely the debate's framing, but the fundamental question of whether the Republican Party's institutional structures, the donors, the state party organizations, the elected officials, would maintain sufficient connection to the Trump campaign to support the ground operation that any general election required. The calls from Republican senators came in steadily through the weekend. Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, announced that he would no longer campaign with or defend Trump, a statement of sufficient weight that it required careful parsing to determine whether it was a withdrawal of the endorsement or merely a spatial one. Ryan was not unendorsing precisely, but was declining to appear in the same rooms, which was the political equivalent of a spouse announcing they still loved you but would be sleeping in a different house. Trump responded to Ryan with the now characteristic directness that had defined his relationship with the party establishment across the entire primary and general election. He attacked him publicly, suggesting on Twitter that Ryan's problem was that he didn't know how to win, and the attack had the quality of a man who had decided, in the pressure of the weekend's crisis, that the party he was nominally leading was not a resource he was prepared to be constrained by, that the coalition he was assembling was independent of its institutional structures and would survive without them if survival required it. The second debate, which arrived on October 9th, 2 days after the tape, was the pressure test of this theory. Trump arrived at Washington University, having spent the preceding 48 hours in a mode that the professional political class had no adequate vocabulary for. Not exactly defiant, not exactly chastened, operating in some space between those categories that seemed to be specific to him alone, a man who had absorbed a potentially fatal blow and was walking toward the next engagement with the particular quality of forward motion that either signals recovery or precedes collapse. The press conference with the Clinton accusers, held in the debate venue 90 minutes before the debate began, was the public declaration that the crisis posture had been chosen, not the contrite apology, not the strategic retreat, not the conventional management that would have traded some votes among the base for the possibility of recovering ground among moderate Republicans, but the escalation, the counterattack, the transformation of the most damaging moment of the campaign into a launching pad for the most audacious maneuver of the debate season. Whether the strategy worked in any measurable electoral sense was debated by analysts across the campaign's final weeks with the urgency of people who understood that the answer would not be available until November 8th. What was not debatable was what the strategy revealed about the man executing it, that his tolerance for operating in the space between crisis and catastrophe was not merely high but appeared in some fundamental way to be higher than the space's other occupants could sustain. He was most dangerous, most focused, most operationally precise when the situation was most dire, which was either a gift of temperament or a pathology of risk. And the distinction between those two characterizations would be argued in the scholarship of his presidency for decades to come. The tape had not ended his campaign. The tape had, in some specific and paradoxical way, clarified it, had stripped away the remaining ambiguity about what kind of candidate he was and what kind of support he was drawing on, and what the election was actually about, and had left, in the clarity's wake, a contest between two visions of America so fundamental and so irreconcilable that the 31 days remaining before Election Day felt less like the conclusion of a campaign than the beginning of something for which the campaign had only been the extended, turbulent, and still barely comprehensible prologue. Chapter 59. The November 8th Realignment. The returns come in waves, and each wave is wrong. At 6:47 in the evening, the first exit polls circulate through the war room on the 14th floor of Trump Tower, and the numbers are catastrophic. Hillary Clinton is up by double digits in Pennsylvania. She holds a commanding lead in Michigan. Wisconsin, which no Republican presidential nominee has carried since Ronald Reagan in 1984, is not even considered a battleground. The television analysts are already drafting their victory narratives, their chyrons preloaded, their champagne metaphors cued. In the campaign's makeshift headquarters, a floor that smells of fast food wrappers and printer toner and the specific electricity of people who have not slept properly in months, the mood curdles. Aides exchange looks that are not quite despair but are auditioning for it. And Donald Trump, standing in a back corridor, in a dark suit and a red tie that falls precisely to his belt buckle, stares at the numbers on a printed sheet and says nothing for a long moment. Then he says flatly, to no one in particular, "Those are wrong." It is not bravado. Or rather, it is bravado, but it is bravado rooted in something else, in a peculiar, almost preternatural confidence in his own instincts that has been the organizing principle of his entire adult life. He has felt something on the trail that the pollsters, sealed in their modeling rooms, have not. He has felt it in the size of the crowds, in the decibel level of the arenas, in the particular quality of the rage and hope that has greeted him in Youngstown and Green Bay and Macomb County. He has felt it, and not known precisely how to quantify it, but he has trusted it with the same bone-deep certainty with which he once trusted his read on a piece of Manhattan real estate. The exit polls are wrong. He knows they are wrong before the first actual precincts report. And by 10 o'clock, the country begins, slowly and then all at once, to learn that he is right. The world into which this election arrives is one cracking along fault lines that have been forming for decades. The financial crisis of 2008 has not, for millions of Americans, resolved itself into recovery. It has resolved itself into a new and permanent condition: stagnant wages, shuttered factories, communities organized around industries that no longer exist, and a professional class that speaks the language of resilience and reinvention with a fluency that sounds, to those who cannot access it, like mockery. The opioid epidemic is consuming whole counties in Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky with a lethality that outpaces automobile accidents. The political institutions that are supposed to address these conditions, Congress, the parties, the federal bureaucracy, are held in a contempt so thoroughgoing that it functions less like cynicism and more like grief. The Democratic Party, under Barack Obama, has presided over an economic recovery that is statistically real and experientially invisible to the voters who will decide this election. Hillary Clinton, the most credentialed candidate in the modern history of American presidential politics, carries within her very competence the seeds of her vulnerability. She is the living symbol of an establishment that a vast portion of the electorate has decided with finality it no longer believes in. Trump has read this landscape not through policy papers, but through a performer's instinct for audience. He has understood, before his own party understood, that the Republican coalition was renegotiable, that there were millions of voters in the industrial Midwest who had voted Democratic their entire lives, not out of ideological conviction, but out of habit and economic self-interest, and that both of those things were now in play. His campaign has targeted them with a message stripped of complexity. The system is rigged, the establishment has failed you, I alone can fix it. It is, by any conventional measure, a remarkable oversimplification of governance. It is also, in this moment, exactly what those voters want to hear from someone who appears to believe it with the ferocity of a man who has nothing to lose, even if he has, by almost every material measure, more to lose than anyone in the room. The core conflict of this night is not merely electoral. It is epistemological. Every institution that has claimed authority over political reality in America, the polling firms, the major newspapers, the television networks, the academic forecasters, the fundraising models, the experienced operatives, has pointed to the same conclusion. Hillary Clinton will be the 45th President of the United States. The 538 model gives Trump a roughly 30% chance of winning, which is the highest of the major forecasters, and this number is treated by the commentariat as evidence of eccentricity rather than genuine uncertainty. The New York Times upshot needle, which will become the most watched graphic in the history of political journalism, sits at Clinton plus 85 as the first polls close. The establishment is not merely predicting a Clinton victory. It has priced a Clinton victory into every assumption it makes about the future. Trump is running not just against a candidate, but against a consensus, and the consensus is, in the precise sense of the term, the core conflict he must overcome to win. What makes this conflict extraordinary is that he has largely manufactured it himself. He has spent the final weeks of the campaign in the states the consensus has written off, holding events in Michigan for the first time in the general election campaign, at a moment when his senior advisors are telling him it is a waste of time and the data suggests otherwise. He has pushed into Wisconsin when the party infrastructure has abandoned it. He has insisted on Pennsylvania despite numbers that, for any other Republican nominee, would have settled the question months earlier. His campaign manager, Kellyanne Conway, has worked with a data operation led by Brad Parscale that has quietly, methodically identified the specific counties in these states where turnout could be shifted, where Obama to Trump voters exist in sufficient numbers to flip the arithmetic. The campaign is running two operations simultaneously, the one visible to the press, which looks like chaos, and the one invisible to the press, which is targeting digital advertising with a precision the Clinton campaign, for all its professionalism, has not anticipated. There is a moment, sometime around 9:30 in the evening, that serves as the keyhole through which the entire character of this campaign can be examined. The networks call Florida for Trump. It is not expected this early. The margin is razor thin, but it is decisive, and it means that the Clinton campaign's path to the presidency has just become significantly narrower. In the Fox News studio in Manhattan, the analysts fall briefly silent. On CNN, John King stands at the magic wall with an expression suggesting that the map has begun behaving in ways he did not anticipate. And in Trump Tower, where the candidate has returned after leaving his election night party in the ballroom below, the energy shifts from controlled anxiety to something more dangerous, genuine possibility. Trump, watching the Florida call on a television in a private room, does not celebrate. He sits forward. He is already thinking about the next state. An aide later recalls that he asked immediately about Broward County's outstanding vote, about how it might affect the final margin, about whether the lead was safe. He is processing. He is, in this moment, neither the blustering showman of the rallies nor the aggrieved plaintiff of the press conferences. He is a man doing arithmetic, and he is doing it faster and more accurately than almost anyone around him. This capacity to process competitive information with sudden clarity under pressure, to trust his own read of a situation against the professional consensus, is both his greatest political asset and, in the years ahead, the source of his most consequential miscalculations. The figure who looms largest in this chapter is not on the ballot. Steve Bannon, the former Breitbart News chairman who joined the campaign in its final desperate stretch in August, has been the ideological architect of the closing argument. Where Paul Manafort had brought the apparatus of the traditional GOP, and where Corey Lewandowski had channeled the raw energy of the early movement, Bannon has provided something different, a coherent, if dark, theory of political change. He speaks of a populist nationalist realignment, of a fourth turning in American civic life, of an establishment so corrupt and so calcified that only a Category 5 disruption can dislodge it. He and Trump have not always agreed. Their relationship is one of mutual use rather than mutual respect, a transaction between a man who wants power and a man who wants a vehicle for an idea, but in the final weeks they have found a shared language. The language is grievance, crystallized into a political program. On election night, as the states fall one by one into the red column, Bannon stands in the war room and watches with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a confirmation he has always privately expected. The relationship between these two men, each volcanic in his way, each convinced of his own indispensability, will define and then fracture the early administration in ways that neither of them, in this triumphant night, can yet foresee. Pennsylvania falls at 2:29 in the morning. It is the decisive call, the state that transforms what might have been an electoral college squeaker into a map of startling breadth. Trump carries 306 electoral votes to Clinton's 232. He loses the popular vote by nearly 3 million, a fact that will haunt the legitimacy debates for years. But the Electoral College is the only metric that determines the winner of the American presidency, and by that metric, the outcome is not close. He has carried Michigan by 10,000 votes out of nearly 5 million cast. He has carried Wisconsin by 23,000. He has carried Pennsylvania by 44,000. The margins are gossamer. The consequence is absolute. The blue wall that Democrats have treated as structural permanence, the industrial Midwest as an electoral birthright, has collapsed in a single night, undone by turnout surges in rural counties, and by a defection of working-class white voters without college degrees that the models had consistently underestimated. When Trump appears in the ballroom at the Hilton in Midtown Manhattan, shortly before 3 in the morning, he is subdued in a way that surprises those who have watched him for years. The performance is restrained. He thanks his family, thanks Pence, thanks his campaign team. He speaks of binding the wounds of division, of being a president for all Americans. It is, by his own standard, a moment of something approaching solemnity. Whether it represents a genuine reckoning with the gravity of what he has won, or simply the exhaustion of a 70-year-old man at the end of the longest campaign of his life, is a question that his closest aides debate afterward, reaching no consensus. What they agree on is this: he looks, in that moment, genuinely surprised. Not by the victory. He has maintained for hours that the exit polls were wrong and that he would win. But by something subtler, something in the weight of the room and the faces of the people around him. He looks, for perhaps the first and last time in the public theater of his political life, like a man who has just realized the full dimensions of what he has been handed. The television cameras cut, at some point in the gray early morning, to the Javits Center in Manhattan, where Hillary Clinton's campaign has gathered beneath a glass ceiling that was meant to be shattered in an entirely different way. The balloons do not fall. The crowd disperses in silence and in tears. In Chappaqua, the concession call is placed. In Washington, Barack Obama prepares to welcome his successor to the White House in a meeting that neither man has prepared for, emotionally, whatever their logistical readiness. The transfer of power, that ritual at the heart of the American democratic experiment, begins its slow machinery. And in the weeks between the ballroom in Midtown and the steps of the Capitol, as Trump assembles a cabinet of generals and billionaires and ideologues, as Bannon is named chief strategist and Priebus chief of staff in a pairing that announces its own internal contradictions, as the intelligence community begins preparing its classified briefings on Russian interference in the election that Trump has just won, in all of this transition, a question begins forming at the edges of the story that no one yet has the language to fully ask. He has won by trusting his instincts against every expert, every model, every institutional consensus. He has been right. And now he will govern with the same philosophy. And the country will spend the next 4 years learning at great cost what it means when that philosophy encounters the one thing no instinct can overcome, the irreducible complexity of power itself. Chapter 60. The Cabinet Selection. The elevator doors at Trump Tower parted like a theater curtain, and Mitt Romney stepped out onto the marble lobby floor on November 19, 2016, his jaw set in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed composure. He had called Donald Trump a fraud. He had called him a phony. He had stood at the Hinckley Institute at the University of Utah in March and delivered what amounted to the most sustained personal assault on a presidential candidate by a member of his own party in modern political memory. And now here he was, moving through the gilded atrium of his former adversary's building, the building whose name had become something of a symbol, making his way toward a dinner at Jean Georges where the man he had eviscerated would sit across from him, and sources in the room would later recall, order the lamb chops, and watch Romney with the patient, measuring eyes of a man who had not forgotten a single syllable. The cameras were, of course, everywhere. That was not an accident. The weeks between November 8th and the January 20th inauguration constituted one of the strangest interregnums in the modern American political calendar. The country had elected a man who had never held public office, never commanded a military unit, never administered a government agency of any size, and the machinery of transition, the briefing books, the agency review teams, the security clearances, the 1,000 bureaucratic sinews that connect one administration to the next, was now in the hands of people who had, many of them, spent the better part of 18 months simply trying to get Trump to the finish line. Governing, the hard institutional labor of it, was a different country entirely, and the passport had only just arrived. The social pressure of the moment was unlike anything Washington's professional class had previously metabolized. The city was still in a condition resembling clinical shock. The Democratic establishment, which had assumed with a confidence bordering on theological certainty that Hillary Clinton would win, was processing not merely defeat, but a kind of epistemological rupture. The pollsters, the consultants, the columnists, who had written Trump's political obituary so many times that the prose had become a kind of liturgy, they were now scrambling to explain a result their frameworks had been architecturally incapable of predicting. Meanwhile, the Republican establishment faced its own reckoning. The party had been captured, its apparatus commandeered, its ideological furniture rearranged by a man who had registered as a Democrat, then an independent, then a Republican, and who held many of its founding doctrines with what could charitably be called flexibility. These were the men and women now presenting their credentials at Trump Tower, riding that elevator, hoping to be useful, hoping to survive. And Trump, for his part, was conducting what he would later call, with evident pleasure, the hottest show in town. The core conflict of the transition was not, as it was often characterized in the press, a simple matter of disorganization, though disorganization there certainly was. The deeper struggle was structural and almost philosophical. Trump was attempting to staff the executive branch of the United States government according to principles: loyalty, personal chemistry, the ability to perform well on television, aesthetic presentation, that had served him well across 4 decades of private enterprise, but that existed in profound tension with the institutional demands of governing a nation of 330 million people. The federal government is not a company. It cannot be run by the chairman's temperament alone. It requires a latticework of expertise, of deputies and deputies' deputies, of people who know where the bodies are buried in regulatory code stretching back to the New Deal. Trump had spent his career hiring people he could fire. The civil service had its own ideas about that. Chris Christie had been running the formal transition operation for months, accumulating the binders and personnel lists and agency review protocols that a responsible transition requires. He was, by most accounts, doing the work seriously. He understood the stakes. He had been a federal prosecutor. He knew what government looked like from the inside. And then, in the days immediately following the election, Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner, working in what colleagues described as an unusual alignment of interests given their otherwise frosty relationship, moved to effectively dismantle Christie's apparatus. The binders were, in the telling that circulated through transition circles, literally thrown away. Christie was removed. Mike Pence, the newly elected vice president, was installed as transition chairman. A structure months in the building was cleared away in days, and the operation began again, more or less from scratch. What this meant, practically, was that the cabinet selection process operated simultaneously on 2 tracks that did not always communicate clearly with each other. There was the formal process, run through Pence's team, which evaluated candidates on conventional grounds: experience, ideology, Senate confirmability. And then there was Trump's process, which ran through Trump himself, through his instincts, his television watching, his phone calls at odd hours, his conversations with friends in the business world and in the media ecosystem that had grown up around him. Men and women were considered and discarded based on factors that defied systematic explanation. One candidate was reportedly dinged for the fit of his suit. Another, for the way he had handled a television interview. The appearance of strength mattered enormously to Trump, as it always had, and he evaluated potential cabinet secretaries with something of the same eye he had once applied to the casting of The Apprentice. The parade up Fifth Avenue became its own form of governance by spectacle. The images of the meetings were controlled and released with an awareness of visual narrative that no previous transition had deployed so deliberately. Rudy Giuliani came. General James Mattis came, his bearing so thoroughly martial that Trump afterward told associates, using the phrase that would follow Mattis through his tenure and beyond, that he looked the part, that he looked like Central Casting's idea of a defense secretary, which was, in Trump's calculus, not a trivial qualification. Rex Tillerson, the chief executive of ExxonMobil, arrived with the gravity of a man accustomed to negotiating with sovereign governments, which he was, and Trump was drawn to the scale of what Tillerson represented: the globe-spanning competence, the ease in rooms full of powerful men. He would select him for state. General Michael Flynn, who had been one of Trump's most visible surrogates during the campaign, was named National Security Advisor. And then there was Romney. The Romney courtship was the transition's most operatic subplot, and it revealed something essential about the internal dynamics of the incoming administration. For a period of roughly 2 weeks, it genuinely appeared possible that the man who had delivered the most scorching public indictment of Trump's fitness for the presidency would be named to lead the State Department. Trump seemed to relish the symmetry of it in one mood and bristle against it in another. He told associates that Romney had style, that he looked the part. But Kellyanne Conway, who had managed the general election campaign, and who understood both Trump's psychology and the emotional landscape of his core supporters with considerable precision, went to the press in a way that was, to put it gently, unusual for a senior advisor to a president-elect. She expressed publicly the reservations of Trump's base. She spoke of betrayal. She spoke of the people who had stayed loyal through the long dark months of the Access Hollywood tape and the debate ambushes and the relentless institutional disapproval, and she asked in so many words whether their fidelity would be honored or overlooked. It was a remarkable intervention, and it worked. Tillerson got state. Romney, who had swallowed his pride and eaten the lamb chops, went home to Massachusetts. The Romney episode, examined carefully, functions less as a story about Romney than as a story about the emerging power structure of the Trump White House before it had even formally constituted itself. The lesson it encoded was simple and durable. Proximity to Trump's emotional core, the ability to speak to his instinct for loyalty and reciprocity, mattered more than formal organizational authority. Conway had no veto power over personnel decisions. She had something more useful. She understood what Trump feared, the accusation of weakness, of being played, of being used by people who privately disdained him, and she had surfaced that fear at the precise moment when it could redirect a decision. The White House that was about to be born would run, more than any in recent memory, on exactly this kind of emotional current. The selection of Steve Bannon as chief strategist, announced alongside Reince Priebus as chief of staff, in a pairing that was itself a kind of institutional declaration of internal tension, signaled something beyond the ordinary ideological positioning of a new administration. Bannon had spent the previous decade building Breitbart News into the online cathedral of what he called the nationalist populist movement, a project rooted in a coherent if radical theory of civilizational conflict, of elites arrayed against working people, of a permanent political class that served its own interests while the country hollowed out. He was, by any measure, an intellectual with a system, a man who had read Evola and Strauss, and who had theories about fourth turnings and the cyclical collapse of orders. Trump had no such system. Trump had instincts, appetites, and a preternatural sensitivity to the gravitational field of public attention. The question of whether these two men, one with a theology, one with a temperament, could work in durable alignment was one that Washington's more careful observers were already beginning to formulate, though the answer would not arrive for several months. The Department of Education went to Betsy DeVos, a Michigan billionaire and longtime advocate for school choice, whose most visible qualification in the eyes of Trump's critics was the scale of her family's financial support for Republican causes over the decades. Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon who had been Trump's most unexpected rival in the primary before becoming one of his more loyal supporters, was named Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a selection that provoked the observation, delivered acidly by more than one commentator, that Carson's qualification for overseeing the federal housing apparatus appeared to consist primarily of having once lived in a house. These appointments were not accidental provocations. They were consonant with a theory, articulated variously by Bannon and by Trump himself, that the institutions of the administrative state were not neutral instruments of governance, but entrenched obstacles to the change the election had mandated, and that the appropriate response was to send into each department a leader who would either dismantle its accretions or rattle its certainties. The choice of Rex Tillerson at state deserves its own accounting, because it illuminates the degree to which Trump's personnel process, chaotic as it appeared from outside, was not without a coherent internal logic. Tillerson had, as the chief executive of the world's largest publicly traded oil company, negotiated production agreements and access deals with Russia, with the Persian Gulf states, with governments across the arc of the developing world. He held the Order of Friendship, bestowed by Vladimir Putin, which would become a line of attack during his confirmation hearings. But Trump's attraction to Tillerson ran deeper than the Russia connection. Tillerson was, in Trump's vision of the world, a businessman who had operated on the global stage without the constraints of ideology or the timidity of the career diplomat. He had made deals. He had extracted value. He was, in the language of the executive suite, a closer. That this vision of diplomacy, transactional, bilateral, agnostic about alliances and values, would eventually produce catastrophic friction between the Secretary of State and the career foreign service he was about to lead, was not a possibility that much troubled the transition team in those November weeks. The inaugural cabinet was, taken in aggregate, the wealthiest in American history. Its collective net worth exceeded that of its three predecessors combined. Several members had spent careers in industries whose federal regulators they were now being asked to lead. The foxes, critics charged, had been handed the keycodes to the henhouses. Supporters answered that only people who had built things, who had run organizations, who had met payroll and navigated markets, were equipped to reform an administrative state that had calcified across decades of insider management. Both arguments contained truth, and neither fully captured the stranger, more personal logic by which the tower on Fifth Avenue was staffing the offices on Pennsylvania Avenue. On December 19, 2016, the Electoral College formally cast its votes, confirming what the November returns had already decided. The transition churned forward. Mike Flynn was preparing his National Security Council briefings. In the offices of the incoming White House counsel, attorneys were working through the disclosure forms and divestiture plans required by a team whose financial entanglements spanned the known world. And somewhere in that vast apparatus of preparation and anticipation, in the classified briefings and the personnel files and the competing power centers already sketching their battle lines, there were questions accumulating in the dark. About Russia, about Flynn, about what exactly had moved in the weeks and months before the election, that no amount of cabinet making and inaugural planning would in the end be able to hold back. The first presidency, dismantling consensus 2017 to 2021.